I want to thank John and the Center for doing this program, and they've all been interesting, and this one I'm sure will be as interesting as well. And thank all of you for making the time to come and be part of this program. I guess just to launch, what I would say is that I think when we came into office in 1989, or actually 1990, there were really great expectations from us, for us, about environmental concerns for a number of reasons. One of which is my work in Congress was largely in the environmental field. I was the chairman of the committee that had jurisdiction, and we got a lot of very important things done. So we had a little bit of a reputation to start with. Over and above that, the problem in New Jersey was fairly serious. There were problems, environmental problems, that were at the top of the agenda. I mean, the Jersey Shore was closed as much as it was opened at that period of time. We had solid waste problems, a whole lot of other problems as well. I used that set of circumstances, having a little bit of a reputation and the existence of problems in the campaign, to highlight the goals and aspirations we had for the environment. And I think it resonated with people. I tease Congressman Corder, who I see every once in a while, about how on the environment, he was very good on a whole lot of issues. The environment, he was not particularly good. But his advisors told him he had to do something about it, so he started making things up. And in my inevitable way of overkill, I went after him with a vengeance, which was really one of the few things I regret about my political career, was in that campaign listening to political consultants, the ones not here, who talked me into approving an ad that was critical of him for his environmental record by putting a picture of him with a Pinocchio nose that kept expanding. It was demeaning to him and to me as well, but it was one of the few things I regret about campaigning, subordinating my own good judgment to that of a campaign consultant. But we've done a lot of good things, and just as a summary of my observations at the beginning of this program, looking at what goes on in the world today in terms of legislative accomplishments, governmental cooperation, and achieving of legitimate public interest goals, we did a lot. And I mentioned to a couple of people before that having these events is very pleasurable for me because it requires me to go back and think about things to prepare for them. And you get a sense of the magnitude of the things that we did that are in the public interest. So today we're going to talk about some of them in the hopes that people who view these things, review the materials in research for scholarly purposes, will have at least access to what it is that was done, and then perhaps more importantly, what it is that we can take from what was done so as to be able to shape events going forward. So it's just not nostalgia, it's something that's practically of use. So thank you very much.
Thank you. There are several people not here who are going to be coming later in the afternoon. In the spirit of what the governor just said, we recognize we can't discuss every issue in one afternoon, and not every topic can be neatly categorized into 4 panels, even if we called one other environmental initiatives as we did. There's still some that don't fall into there. But that said, I'd ask everyone to try to keep their remarks brief. Feel free to supplement them in writing. It's one of the benefits of doing this online is we can add to this as we go along and add references to things that come up during the discussion, like the ad with Pinocchio. I'll try to keep us on schedule and may need to ask that we move on from time to time to get to the next topic. Jim Florio was elected governor on November 7th, 1989, and sworn in on January 16th, 1990. His initial cabinet included Judy Askin as DEP commissioner and Scott Weiner as president of what was then called the Public Utilities Commission. 1 year later, Commissioner Yaskin resigned to return to the Superior Court, and Governor Florio chose Scott Weiner to be the new DEP commissioner. Then toward the end of the term, Scott became the governor's counsel, and Jeanne Fox moved up to serve as acting commissioner. The condition and image of the Department of Environmental Protection in January of 1990 was, I think, accurately captured by Michael Catania, who was at that time a once and future deputy commissioner of the department. In a transition report he submitted that month in January of 1990, he wrote, in its 20-year history, DEP has grown incredibly fast. During the Kane administration, some 50 laws were enacted which created major new DEP programs or imposed substantial responsibilities on the department. These responsibilities have been handled with very mixed success. While New Jersey is regarded nationwide as a leader among states in the environmental area, the fact remains that DEP is also an agency with staggering management problems and severe public relations problems with the regulated community, environmentalists, the legislature, local officials, and the general public. Catania's transition report then moves on to a section on immediate issues and problems. And second on his list of immediate issues and problems is the establishment of the environmental prosecutor. He writes, given the attention focused on this issue during the campaign, it is crucial that the responsibilities of this new position be assigned as soon as possible. So with that, as way of introduction, I'll turn to the first environmental prosecutor, Steve Madonna.
Thank you very much. Folks, I decided to just put some comments together and read them for you, and then Charlie Licata is going to take over, and he's going to give you some specifics on other things. So bear with me if the state of New Jersey, like most states in the United States, has a significant commitment of manpower and resources within three primary components of its enforcement effort. These include administrative enforcement elements, civil enforcement elements, and criminal enforcement elements. The New Jersey State Police, Marine Services Bureau, and the Solid and Hazardous Waste Unit each have responsibilities which overlap these three primary enforcement components. Each of these enforcement components utilize resources of varying degrees of intensity depending upon the nature, extent, and timing of appropriate initiatives or response. While each enforcement mode has the potential to be effective when used properly, each can be grossly ineffective and even counterproductive if used in an untimely or uncoordinated manner. In an effort to maximize the government's utilization of these resources, Governor Florio established the Office of the Environmental Prosecutor. You know what I always think to say, and I think you can identify this with this very easily. We have Marines, we have Navy, we have Air Force, we have Army. Can you imagine them at war with somebody and not having a supreme command? And that's what was going on in the environmental area. We had people with these three different backgrounds, administrative, civil, and criminal, and they would go to a site, and after a while it got to be so, this is before I was the environmental prosecutor, I would go to a situation and I just look around a couple seconds to see if anybody's stepping forward, and then I would go in and take over. Because not that I was pushing the criminal side, but that you had to, we had a whole load of drums found in a building, and what was next door to the building? People living. So as important as it might seem to get search warrants and all this, it was more important to stabilize this situation for these people. And that's what I did before I had any kind of real power to do it, but yeah, I think you had to do it, okay? We were housed in the Justice Complex, and there were 16 individuals in the environmental prosecutor's staff, and only 3 were hired from outside. We used attorneys and other people from inside. We did not mean, the governor and myself and Attorney General Del Tufo did not mean to set up some kind of a fancy hierarchy with all kinds of people and whatever. It was meant to be efficient, right, to enforce things expeditiously and efficiently. First step in creating a comprehensive statewide environmental enforcement program, one of the primary responsibilities of the state environmental prosecutor, was establishing a system of coordination of the initiatives, personnel, and resources of the various environmental enforcement divisions and departments. The SEP initiated the appointment of representatives within each of the divisions and departments to act as liaison with our office. The assistant state environmental prosecutors were likewise assigned to coordinate and manage the relevant enforcement activities of these various divisions and departments. They've also been instrumental in establishing working protocols of operation with their respective liaisons and agency. The coordination of the use of the resources and personnel within these state agencies by the State Environmental Prosecutor is designed to maximize the efficiency and effectiveness of the enforcement program. The Office of the Environmental Prosecutor initiated a project that will inventory and make recommendation regarding compliance problems at state facilities. So that we undertook the state facilities. County coordination, very significant. One important component of the environmental program is an increased emphasis on county agency enforcement. The state of New Jersey is divided in, you know how many counties. The county prosecutor's office and county health departments have been designated as the core of the county components of this network. They are looked at as the catalyst in each county for the formation of county environmental enforcement task forces consisting variously of county hazmat teams, county sheriff's departments, public works, emergency services, and the like.
Let me ask, was there opposition to setting up the environmental prosecutor, or was it sort of universally perceived as a good thing once it was right? I mean, it got into the campaign somehow. Okay. And
This whole cluster of issues that were out there, ocean dumping, and really everyone was very receptive to anything that sounded like remediation for the problems. I mean, the environmental issues obviously disappeared to a large degree from the hierarchy of really serious problems, other than climate change. But in that period of time, the end of the 80s, the end of the Kane administration, this was super high in terms of people needing to do things.
so you, Steve, you were appointed like 2 days after the governor was sworn in, or soon.
Pretty soon thereafter,
Right.
yeah.
And Charlie, you came to it.
Came within a couple of weeks. First 2-3 weeks, I came from the outside, was one of the outsiders.
So was it a success?
Well, let's talk about it, and I think that maybe one of the ways we can do that is think about what the real goals of the prosecutor's office as I saw them were. And they were, as Steve pointed out, policy coordination across the board, whether civil, criminal, or administrative is a more appropriate enforcement mechanism. And then a broader policy that Senator Dalton, I know we're going to talk about later with the Clean Water Enforcement Act, which kind of became a cornerstone of the hardness of the new environmental policies. I think what we were trying to do is we were trying to set a new tone across the board for corporate New Jersey and in the public's mind, both from a DEP policy and an enforcement perspective. And I think on the whole, you would have to say that was successful. Now, getting back to what the governor said about there being no opposition, I'll note that it was your executive order number 6 that established it.
Early.
Number 6, but it was Christine Todd Whitman's number 2 that abolished it. So while it had a significant role and perhaps not a tremendous amount of opposition when it was created, opposition certainly developed over the course of a period of time when we did a number of important things, but things that also annoyed people. I mean, we were kind of on the front end of regulating water during the droughts for golf courses, dealt with the old chromium issues, dealt with with numerous old cases that had been kind of sitting on the dockets, the Ciba-Geigy case, the CPS Madison cases, all the chrome cases. So we took on a very large plate of issues and coupled them with some significant legislative changes that put a lot more oomph behind it. And I think that may have been part of a change in corporate attitude towards being more compliant, but there's certainly less broad support.
There were some egregious examples of the need to pierce the corporate veil, that corporations would get fined or something, but the people who were signing off would not just walk away. There was an effort to try to change it, and that was very controversial.
Yes, it was, and there were numerous enforcement, and just criminal enforcement in general was not a major undertaking in previous administrations, and the volume of it got cranked up, and that got noticed in various industries, in particular, I think, in the solid
One of
waste
the first
industry.
things we did, which was controversial but needed, there was supposed to be 21 each county is going to have an incinerator. And then an extra one for the Meadowlands, so it'll be 22. We stopped that. I mean, and with hindsight, think if that had gone forward. Today we had 22 incinerators working. I mean, it'd be a catastrophe, environmentally as well as economically.
I think maybe we'll wait to talk about Clean Water Enforcement Act till John Bennett
Can I
gets
finish
you.
with one comment?
Yeah, sure.
I was returning late home one night, and down by the river in the area of my home, there's a tanker. I go down to the local police department and I say, can you send a squad car down here to find out what's going on? And, you know, we see a tanker and a river, right away you start thinking dumping. And the police officer said to me that was sitting behind the desk, he said, why doesn't somebody tell us about this? And that's what got us into the training of the local police and health officers and what have you, so that that they would, when they're out on their patrols, they could see the signs of things going wrong.
We'll talk about ocean dumping, clean beaches, and start with Cindy, who was heading Clean Ocean Action then and now.
Right. Well, those were the days, I just have to say. As the governor pointed out, as everybody knows, the late 80s were not a good time for the ocean. You know, we had a lot of stuff washing up on the beaches. Monmouth County started testing water quality, which was a good thing because people weren't testing statewide or anywhere nationally, and when you tested the waters, they came up positive. So there was a lot of closed beaches, as the governor said. It was closed more than it was open. I think 800 beach closures one summer. Todd would know. He reported on all of this. Yeah. Yeah. So it was some bad times, and we were also at that time the ocean dumping capital of the world. We had 8 ocean dump sites off our coast. And I think the public had finally had enough. The American Littoral Society, Derry Bennett, who I was under the tutelage of, informed, the public about a lot of these things. And so we started working on some of those issues. And I think that the public had just had enough, and especially when we started publicizing, the 8 ocean dump sites, or there were 6 at the time, more later. But sewage sludge really was sort of, off the charts for people, just the description of it alone and the idea of it alone, and just 12 miles off our coast. So I think, as congressman, you were very active in that and trying to address those issues as well. And when you became governor, you moved very quickly, and the department was on the way of identifying, the alternatives. And there had been a law passed where ocean dumping had to end by 1991, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, right? Yeah. So I have, but then New York was going to kind of exceed that deadline, and I don't know if you remember, we had the campaign with the blue fish that we signed to get people to sign them all up and down the Jersey Shore, and all businesses had people signing the blue fish, and we brought them up to New York. And I actually have the blue fish that you signed, and the news article, because we wanted to make sure that no more deadlines were going to be exceeded, because this was a long time in coming. I think the first effort was in the 70s to try to stop ocean dumping. So, I mean, it was wonderful. We had that great celebration when we met the deadline on March 17th. And but I think what was key also was the citizens that worked so hard in the Clean Sludge Coalition to identify acceptable alternatives other than incineration. I think that was the first go-to, was to just incinerate it all, as you were saying before. And I think with citizens, we came together, Clean Ocean Action, a number of other groups, the Clean Sludge Coalition, to identify environmentally acceptable alternatives that could potentially beneficially use that material. And I think that was a cornerstone.
From where you were, was there a noticeable shift moving from the Kane administration? Because these issues were already present, or was it a... building on that.
I think it was building on that. I think there was broad support because, when all those those things started washing up on the beach, the dead and dying dolphins, and I mean, people had just had it. And that really provided Congress with the need to do something. And so those laws were passed. And then the state, I think, passed laws as well to add further concrete dates to it. And, again, I wasn't on the inside of the department, so, or at the, in the governor's views on what was going on at that time to make sure that we were going to meet those deadlines, because I'm sure it was very challenging, to meet those short deadlines.
The most significant thing for my grandchildren is they still remember that Pop-Pop cleaned up the ocean. They're all grown up now, but they do remember going on a whale watch and seeing dolphins, whales, brown pelicans, because we really did consciously work to clean up the ocean, which we did to a large degree.
Yes.
I want to just acknowledge the work of someone who is not associated with the environment, a fellow from the Alliance for Action, Ellis Visa, worked very hard to get sewage treatment lifted to a higher level than it had previously been. And we had hypodermic needles. We worked very on the beaches and things of that sort. So going after New York to start putting covers on the barges that they were putting
the
across
garbage
for
barges, right.
garbage, cleaning up medical waste, trading that sort of, we actually made a fairly good impact.
Great impact.
I'll start. I started with DEP on February 23rd, 1981, and my first 3 days were reading EPA manuals, but on my fourth day I got sent out in the field to inspect the Asbury Park treatment plant, which was a little primary plant underneath the boardwalk in Asbury Park. You lifted up a little hatch and you went down into hell to take a look at it. And there was a brick building on the beach. Now, the effluent from the treatment plant, the barely treatment it got, was only 30 feet off the beach. And in the summer, the brick building held the sludge, but the day after Labor Day, all that sludge just got pumped out into the ocean because that's the way it was handled. I remember going inspecting the Freehold area, and there were over 30 wastewater treatment plants just in Freehold and Freehold Township. So we talk about ocean dumping with sludge, and it was, with all the 8 sludge dumpers. We used to work with a crazy guy you probably remember named Lester Jargowski, who was the Monmouth County Health Officer who was trying to buy a PT boat with a 50 caliber machine gun in the front to follow the sludge barges, and he was absolutely Vietnam vet serious about it. But the thing I think about is, like, the identification during the 80s was the big thing to get people to finally say, I had enough. I mean, I remember George McCann getting a bright idea to go to Brooklyn and dumping all these plastic bottles in the ocean to prove that New York was polluting our beaches, until they all washed up on our beaches and we got criticized for pollution on our own beaches. But then the implementation came during Governor Florio's time period, which was the actual harder part. Commissioner Weiner, when I was in the water program, said, you got to go up to Hoboken and tell them that sludge incinerator that they were building with state and federal money has to stop. So we don't have a sludge incinerator in Hoboken. And that was the hard part. I mean, doing those kind of things. And the big deadline was, I'll talk a little bit later in permitting, was July 1, 1988, all primary treatment plants had to sign an agreement to become secondary, not be secondary, but at least sign a consent order. And then with Polluters Playground and Clean Water Enforcement Act, all that came to a crashing halt in about 1989, I guess it was, something like that. So, I mean, ocean dumping was just, something that was very real and very bad.
Todd.
Maybe I'll make a general observation here. I had the privilege of sitting on the outside of a roundtable discussion like this that was taking place among environmental activists and environmental regulators during the Kane administration. And I was struck by how nice it must have been to work in administration at a time when the Bhopal crisis happened in India, and Love Canal, and radon in the basements in Montclair, and these guys the guys and gals were sitting around and talking about how easy it was to pass those 50 new programs that were referenced earlier in the Kane administration, And how much, even the discussion that's taken place so far, indicates the shifts that took place by the time the Florio administration came in. There was enormous public support for the environmental prosecutor, for the Clean Water Enforcement Act, for getting the needles off the beaches, for a worker and community right to know program after the Bhopal thing. Well, I can recall many, many meetings of just getting beaten up by the legislature, by the business community, about the fact that the Worker and Community Right to Know Act required that if there was a bottle of whiteout, remember whiteout? It doesn't exist anymore, in a secretary's drawer, they were required to report it as part of the Worker and Community Right to Know Act. And I think that embodied the difference between the time when there was widespread support for taking dramatic action against in order to protect the environment, to have you overkilled in order to protect the environment, and are you now driving business out of the state? Are you coming down too hard? Is it costing people too much money? And that clash, I think, took place throughout the entire time that we were in office in the Florio administration. I think we got the backlash.
Let me add to that, because the whole right to know issue was an issue that the legislature was very, very involved in and very concerned about. And
I think Dan was the author of it, weren't you?
right, and Dan remembers there was no fun dealing with the issue because there was a lot of controversy, at least in the assembly chambers and also in the Senate, over it. And it was, again, the feeling that we were going too far. Everybody supported the environmental prosecutor. They supported the Clean Water Act. They supported a lot of the other environmental initiatives. But when it came to the right to know, it became very much, we're going too far. We've gone as far as we can go. And the opposition was based upon what Rick's saying, that it was now getting to the point where you had to deal with things like whiteout. And the whiteout is the good example, because that was the example that was used. And there was continuously, I was trying to, as speaker, mediate that issue and trying to help to try to come up with some kind of a compromise. And it wasn't easy, because both sides didn't want to.
We came up with a proposal to change the regulations to provide for a threshold amount over which it had to be reported. We got backlash from the environmental community and also from labor groups.
That's right. There was one group of labor that was very much pushing it, okay? But the majority of the labor community was opposed. And that was part of the reason why there was so much opposition. Dan would remember, and probably can go into more detail than I can, but that was an issue that became very controversial. And to be very honest, it shouldn't have been, but it became a flashpoint as it related to the environment. Because all the other things, clean beaches, everybody was for clean water, clean beaches, dealing with the sludge issue, going after the polluters. But that issue really created a great deal of controversy.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And I oftentimes think about the responsibility when you had a bill like Right to Know, because you didn't want to be the guy to establish this program and then have it not work. And that was what I think Joe was talking about. And so there was a constant back and forth. If you look back, when I look back on Right to Know, I think about the number of amendments that we tacked on the Right to Know. And I would assume it was close to 100 amendments from the original version, and the number of hearings that we had to try to make sure that we had it right. But at the end of the day, you had to make a call, and Right to Know was somewhat illustrative of what we were dealing with in the 80s. In that we were identifying problems and attempting to address problems in the state of New Jersey without having any background anywhere else to look at throughout the country. We were cutting edge on so many of these issues. The Right to Know is a perfect example. We were the first state that had a combined Worker and Community Right to Know Act. So, at the time, Governor Florio comes in and is dealing with these water issues and a lot of the other concerns that he was dealing with. The concern I remember having when Scott was sworn in is he's got just an enormous job on trying to take programs like Right to Know and the other programs that we had passed and then trying to effectively manage them. And I mean, if you just did that, you would have accomplished such a great deal. But we still had more to do, and we were still cutting edge as far as the nation was concerned. So again, it was the identifying the problem, trying to address the problem legislatively, and then, God, I hope DEP can handle this.
The enforcement issue was one of the big problems with the Right to Know, and that legislators were very concerned, how was it going to be enforced? How far down, how much would it interfere in the functioning at the lowest levels? Was it going to get down to that point? And so that was the issue, and Dan did a great job and was able to get people to understand, but it was not an easy process. It was a very difficult process.
The evolving role of the department in this issue was crystallized for me because I was an assistant commissioner, and then I was kept as an assistant commissioner at the beginning of the Whitman administration, and there was a bill to amend the Right to Know Act to make it more, to include fewer substances. And I went over to testify on it, and I testified in opposition because DEP was always in opposition to those amendments. And the chairman was Paul DiGaetano, and he interrupted me at some point and said, let me get this straight. You work in DEP? And I said, yeah. He said, you're opposed to this? I said, yeah. He said, so how come your commissioner called me this morning and told me he supports it? And that was a way policy changes were communicated.
Well, it was interesting because there wasn't unanimity as far as the Kane administration's policy or perspective on Right to Know, because if you were dealing with, I think, Commissioner Huey at the time, he was supportive generally, but if you were dealing with labor or health, they were opposing the bill. So there wasn't one voice with regard to a perspective on Right to Know. And there wasn't even to the end. I mean, I had no idea that Governor Kane was going to sign the bill. I would have, to me, it was a 50-50 shot. Hey, John. But I'm sure John remembers that too. There wasn't any indication from the administration how they were going to come down on the bill. And as I said, you had various commissioners both supporting and opposing the bill. So.
What was frustrating to us 4 years later, in trying to, I don't want to say amend the bill, but to change the regulations so as to at least allow for certain amounts of certain substances that everyone deemed to be non-threatening, to be allowed not to be reported, to make it easier on the reporting community. What was frustrating was that every time we assembled groups of people to try to develop this and to try to get consensus around it, there was always opposition to any kind of retrenchment from one side or another. It never came from the business community, but it always came either from the environmentalists or from the labor groups, that any sign of deviating from what was already specifically in the law and in the regulations would indicate backsliding, and they wouldn't accept that. And when we left office, we had been unable to effectuate any kind of consensus around any changes.
Let's move back to John Bennett's here to the Clean Water Enforcement Act and talk about how that came to be. I don't know who wants. If you've caught your breath.
Yes, thank you, and I apologize to everyone, Governor, for being late. But, I think there was so much that was going on back at the latter part of the 80s where I was in the Assembly and Dan, as the chairman of the committee in the Senate, we kind of both got together and decided that here were two young guys that were going to show that bipartisanship actually worked. I mean, that was something, was unheard of, but, that the Assembly was controlled by the Republicans and the Democrats controlled the Senate, and, and we could have just sat and done nothing. But the Clean Water Enforcement Act came up as an idea where we just were tired of seeing people get away with paying more and pay fines, and it was cheaper business idea than it was to follow the laws. We had the laws, they just weren't following them because it was cheaper to pay a fine to get away with it. And I remember so well how, first of all, it was unheard of, they told me, for a Republican to go against business. That was just like not, I was sacrilege. But it wasn't a Republican thing or a Democratic thing, it was the right thing. That really was what it boiled down to. And we worked really hard in '89, and the governor who was running at that time came out and was supportive of us getting it done, and we're not able to get it done until he came into office. And then I think everybody knew at that point they better get on board or the ship was going to sail. So we made some amendments. Dan and I worked on it. I had now come to the Senate, so and I can't remember. I think the sponsorship changed for a few different people, but we were the two that still were driving the bus, and the governor was so supportive in making sure that it was never the intention to put a corporate CEO in jail. That was never our intention. The intention was to show them if you violated the law once and polluted the environment, you get a fine. If you violated it twice, you were going to get a bigger fine. And if you violated it the third time, you were going to go to jail. You know what? It stopped people violating the law on the third time. And that was the intent. The intent was to stop the just random dumping of things everywhere around the state. And the governor, and I think it was really early in your term when you were able to come forward and sign that bill and make it the law. We made some changes, and then the governor had been supportive of it through the campaign, all the way through, and then after he was inaugurated, I think it was one of the first things we were able to get done and get passed.
It's been one of the things we did in Washington when I was there, and Frank Sweeney's here from my days in Washington. We went after midnight dumpers. In all the remediation legislation we had strict penalties for people that were taking Superfund waste and things of that sort. So yeah, we were very sensitive to the fact that a lot was going on the enforcement side, and people were doing it as a cost of doing business.
Yeah, that's
just
what it was.
carrying it, and that was not sufficient because people would do a cost-benefit analysis. It cost me so much to get rid of it. It cost me a fine. If the fine's not that big, I'd rather pay the fine.
Right.
So we had built a record of that in Washington. So early on, we were able to support it at the state.
And it became a model throughout the United States. Both Dan and I were active in the Council of State Governments, and it became a model law that was used in other states as something to follow, as the right way of trying to stop the dumping, which, I'm sure there's still some of it going on, but as the mentality and the changed. And that's really what had to do with the state of mind, and the way of doing business had to be changed. And so that was what it was. We thank you for that, Governor.
Senator Bennett, if I remember correctly, it was a New Jersey Public Interest Research Group report called Polluter's Playground, which crystallized the need for this kind of legislation. And again, I'm going back over 25 years to try to remember, but I think it,
Have a copy here if you want to see it. Put it on the solid waste plan.
in '89, it got through committee, and it didn't pass in the legislature, I believe, in December of 1989.
No, it did not.
You were very angry that day. I remember you addressing the environmental groups. The department, at that point, strongly opposed the bill.
Yes.
And it led to its defeat. So then in January, Governor Florio came in, and under his leadership, the bill passed the legislature, it was enacted. And again, if I remember correctly, Governor, May 23rd, 1990, in Asbury Park is when you signed that bill. And you were fulfilling a commitment that you had made in Asbury Park in the campaign at the time that you signed it.
think it might have helped that press conference.
And you'll remember that Judge Yaskin arrived late for that press conference, having been at a...
Did I drive it?
No. She came in the helicopter, having
God.
been at an event in South Jersey.
Jeez.
Should we go to harbor dredging?
Shall we, Cindy?
Oh, shall we? Shall we dance?
This, yeah, my. This was an issue that occupied far more of Cindy's and my time than either of us would have liked. But it was a fascinating issue in many ways. This was a situation where the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey sought permission to deepen the channel of Port Newark, Port Elizabeth, and some of the berths. The primary reason being that there were new super tankers that required a draft that was deeper than the harbor would allow. And that if this wasn't done, and done in a fairly expeditious manner, the New York, New Jersey area was going to lose a tremendous amount of shipping business to everywhere from Halifax to Savannah, up and down the East Coast. So, okay, relatively simple problem, right? You just got to go in and dredge and make the harbor deeper. An unfortunate situation arose in that some 20 years earlier, the Diamond Shamrock Company, located on the banks of the Passaic River in Newark, allowed a certain byproduct of its manufacture of Agent Orange to escape into the Passaic River, namely dioxin, which then gravitated over a 20-year period down through the waterways and into Port Newark and Port Elizabeth. And so when it came to dredging, every time you put the dredge down there and the spoils came up, it released the dioxin, and the consequences of that could be severe. The question of how severe was an ongoing question. Our own Department of Division of Science and Research had some disagreements within it. The Environmental Protection Agency, both the regional EPA and the national EPA, had differing standards about what was acceptable or not acceptable for dioxin, particularly in the uptake in critters, which were then uptaken by larger critters and then by fish, which people were going out and fishing out of the Passaic River, and God knows what was happening to them if they were eating it. So, so the Port Authority came up with a plan which involved the Army, well, the Army Corps of Engineers came up with a plan, essentially, which was to dredge and to take the dredge spoils and put it in barges and take it 6 miles out beyond Sandy Hook and dump it into something called the mud dump, which they would then cap with clean soil, and that this would be a reasonable and environmentally protective response. I'd say that the department's position on this was actually neutral because it was really difficult to know whether this would or would not be effective. I'll let Cindy pick up the opposition.
Au contraire. Yes. Well, you know, the mud dump site had been on the radar. It was one of the 8 ocean dump sites, and it had been dumped into for years and years. You know, it was, the dioxin was the new trigger of concern of the many contaminants that were in the mud, in the muck. If you can imagine what the muck up in, you know, the harbor area was like with all the industrial revolution that had occurred there, the chemical revolution. There was also a high PCB contamination issue that was in the mud at the same time, so it was just this cocktail. We called it black mayonnaise because that was a consistency. And, you know, when it was dumped offshore, all the fishermen knew that this stuff just wafted away. It just spread throughout the ocean, and all the worms and crabs and clams that were in there would be trickling down because somehow they were able to survive and uptake all this material. So then the fish would come, and there'd be this feeding frenzy. So the fishermen were excited when the dumping barges would be going out there. I actually went out there one time to experience it and for myself, and it was just extraordinary. The fish really did come in when the barges were dumping. So we felt that we had come off a number of these other dumping issues where we found environmentally sound alternatives, and you know, all the other dump sites had been closed and were on their way of being closed. That it was time to think of something else other than ocean dumping for this contaminated material, and we need to come up with a means to address it. And for sure, one thing we shouldn't do is legalize dioxin dumping in the ocean. So that's when, we geared up and set our attention to and got scientists together to look into not just the concerns about the dredge material, but also what are the alternatives? Where can we perhaps find some decontamination technologies? What have you? Congress stepped up, I think, and got some money through WRDA in future years. But we did wind up going to court. And it was a very interesting case.
It was going to court against DEP, right?
No, against Colonel York, against Colonel York from US EPA.
Corps of Engineers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Army Corps of Engineers, Colonel York. And,
This
is
was
it?
not resolved during this.
No, it was a long, it was, but it did get resolved. There was a bright future at the end of it, but it was a rather challenging time, and I remember there was a lot of anger, and there was a lot of controversy, and there was one public hearing I remember where 1,000 longshoremen showed up, and hundreds of citizens. It was very contentious.
Pushed on by Senator Torricelli, as I recall, when he was in the forefront of that.
Yeah, it was it was challenging times, but I think it was never our intention to block the dredging, because shipping is a very environmentally sound way to move lots of cargo around. So it was never our intention to stop the dredging. It was just we had to find something else other than just dumping it in the ocean.
And I think it put the department in a very, very awkward position. I would say that throughout the entire time that this was going on, and it probably lasted a couple of years, really, until the end of our administration, I really felt as though we wanted to be supportive of the environmental opposition, but we had no scientific basis for making that determination, and at the same time, we didn't want to be seen as being preventative of shipping interests. And so I think our neutral position, if you were, was often mistaken for being supportive of the Army Corps and being supportive of the Port Authority, and I felt awkward and uncomfortable, I think, for us in that position. I don't think it was the governor's position to be automatically supportive of either side on this, but wanted to have some scientific basis for a decision, and that was never, unfortunately, forthcoming during the time that we were dealing with it. I think, Jeanne, you ultimately ended up with it.
Oh, yeah. Yes. And it worked, we worked it through. I mean, we felt there was a lot of science to support, and then when EPA went out and actually looked at what was going on out there, we called it the toxic stain, but the contamination that had oozed out from the little 2-mile square box that they had put in the ocean, as this is the dump site, the area of contamination was well beyond that. And it was, toxic and to aquatic life, and the levels of contamination were very high. So, over time there was that evidence, and then we were able to move forward. And I think New Jersey became, a leader nationally in coming up with the solutions to those and coming up with really great ways of using material.
I should probably say for the record, EPA's testing of critters and ocean life showed that only the lobster, the bile, I think it was the bile on the lobster, maybe. So there wasn't any risk to eating the food sources out there. To me, it was a political situation. And I had no problem with not doing this, but the issue is where do you put the dredge materials? And my personal feeling is that but for the public hoopla that went on for a number of years, it would have been a lot cheaper to cover, ended up covering landfills, but it would have been a lot cheaper to cover landfills because it would have been like almost free cover. Unfortunately, we had to treat it as contaminant material, so the landfills charged a lot of money to cover the landfills with that material. So it would have been nicer if it was done not publicly, but it wasn't. So it cost a lot of money to use what's perfectly safe for cover materials, because the landfill owners took advantage of the public hoopla saying that this is contaminated material. Obviously, what's in the ocean is contaminated because you might have critters eat it, but using it for a landfill cover, totally not.
I recall that putting it on trains and sending it to Texas was a
That
very
was
popular,
the
very
ultimate.
popular
That was
possibility.
the ultimate, right?
The thing that's striking me is, not surprisingly, how the passage of time smooths out a lot of the controversy. And as I look back at that period of time, I forget how you described it, Rick, but it was probably one of the most tumultuous issues we had to deal with. It was an intractable issue where, despite the absence of fact or science or something for us to grab onto, there seemed to be no way to address the political tug and pull that was going on. And with my memory fading, what's being dredged up for me are feelings of being squeezed with no way to come up with some kind of process or dialogue where we could figure out how to get to the solution that everybody wanted to get to, which was not to shut down shipping, but to do it in an environmentally sane way.
Well, Kurt Moore and I wrote a three-part series about this crisis back in 1993. We did pretty exhaustive research, and it was an extremely controversial issue with, the pro-port forces, worried about job losses if the port shut down, and the environmentalists saying no more dumping. So, dumping began in that area, I think, in 1888, from what I recall, or for the late 1800s, and there's still uncontaminated material being put out there in the historic area, the HARS.
Historic area
remediation site.
Otherwise known as the
Yep.
toxic stain to us.
And they're still, they're actually still trying to cover up the contaminated material out there as we speak, as far as I know. They're trying to cover all the contaminated material with a meter of uncontaminated or relatively uncontaminated material. So it's still ongoing, right?
Yes, it is. I mean, it'd be really interesting for this story to be told about if anybody was interested. I mean, it's not being managed very well, and actually there's a lot of clean sand now that's being dumped out there, super clean, like beach sand is being dredged out of Sandy Hook and dumped offshore, which is really a waste because we just spent money putting it on the beach, and now we're digging it up and taking it out to the ocean. It just doesn't make any sense. And then we're starving our borough areas for the beach sand material, and so now we're looking for new areas of sand. And again, so I think some of our public policies need to be brought back and assessed. But I do really feel that we had science to be concerned about the issue, and it was one of the most challenging issues to work on. I mean, the mud dump site was the last one to be closed, but again, I think that what resulted was actually a win-win all the way around. We got the harbor dredged deeper. And we got solutions to the material that helped remediate some of the landfills that are now back in society and doing things. And, I think it really worked out in the end, but I would agree with you. It was a painful time because each side was, in its silo, I guess, but we never really wanted to shut down the harbor. But that's what everybody, all the longshoremen, they want to shut down the harbor. They want to shut down the harbor, and that was not in any of our positions at all. So it was, messaging got really kind of muddy, if you will, and but at the end of the day, I think it worked out. Everybody kind of came together at the
We're
end.
only allowed 2 puns per topic. So let's talk about permitting and enforcement more generally, and part of what I think it needs is an introduction, which Scott will talk about more in a few minutes, was the way that Scott reorganized the department when he became commissioner was to take most or all of the permitting programs and put them together, and most or all of the enforcement programs and put them together. And Dennis was heavily involved in the permitting, and Ed was heavily involved in the enforcement, among others who were here. So,
To the senior member.
Oh, ouch.
I thought I beat you in the race last time.
You absolutely did.
Well, I don't have too much to say other than we had a philosophy, fair but firm enforcement. That was our overall philosophy. It was an era, you touched on it, Senator Bennett, of polluter pays, so we were trying to pay attention to that. I'm not so sure that that resonates anymore.
Oh, dear.
Under Commissioner Weiner, he had the separate enforcement programs, hazardous waste enforcement, clean water enforcement, air pollution enforcement. He had them unified, brought together under an enforcement wing so that there would be some consistency to the approach throughout the department rather than each group having their own philosophy and their own way of handling things. So that's pretty much what I have to say. I'm sorry I was late too, but I'm sure you covered the environmental prosecutor already. And I just wanted to put in a plug. Having done criminal in environmental enforcement before the environmental prosecutor and doing it after the environmental prosecutor, I would say the beauty of having the environmental prosecutor was it made sure the criminal environmental unit spoke in a clear way with the civil environmental enforcement people. And I'm not suggesting that it didn't occur without the environmental prosecutor, but it was more personality driven. If the folks in the Attorney General's office and the DEP could communicate, there was good coordination. But without that, there wouldn't be, and that was one of the beauties, I guess I should say, of having an environmental prosecutor, because it institutionalized that good communication.
And I think that what you talked about, the coordination inside the department of all the different enforcement units, to a certain perspective, the environmental prosecutor's office served across civil, criminal, administrative, county, municipal, up and down the government chain, and attempted to put a coordinated face on it.
Ed's being too kind to me. He used to beat John and I up pretty good. Coming out of the Kane administration, and then you have the Clean Water Enforcement Act coming in, I was hired by John to run what was the New Jersey Pollution Discharge Elimination System permitting program. That was a complete disaster, not working. And we had a situation where there were no permits going out. All the old permits were being automatically enforced with limits that either weren't acceptable. And then you had things like a bunch of nuns being drug over to the legislature because they had Clean Water Enforcement Act penalties, and Ed come and say, what are you guys going to do about it? I'm only doing my job. Commissioner Weiner, John, they hired me, and he called us up, and he said, I remember to this day, he goes, I want you to go away for 3 months, and I don't want to hear from you, and I don't want to see you. But in 3 months, you're going to tell me what's the problem and what you're going to do about it, and you better fix it. And over time, we did, I think. I think we did a pretty good job of that. But there was another thing that we did at the time that I can't imagine doing now, was this thing called a sewer ban. And you would be able to say, if the DEP puts you on a sewer ban, no COs in a house, no commercial connections, and the Middlesex County Utilities Authority treatment plant, they kept telling us it was all the stormwater, and when we looked at it, no, it wasn't. It was broken, and they weren't fixing it. And I'm sure the governor was involved in this decision, because when we put Middlesex County Utilities Authority on a sewer ban in the early 90s, in the go-go 90s, Fred Kurtz, Craig, John Lynch went berserk. Every development all up and down Route 1 was stopped. Ellis Vieser, that the governor talked about, called me up. They said, can I come talk? And with Ellis, he had 2 tones of voice, screaming and really screaming. And I showed up, and there were 300 developers in his conference room just saying, what are we going to do about it? But we stuck to our guns, and Middlesex County had to upgrade their treatment plant. And you can't imagine, I can't imagine anybody doing that kind of stuff, even though it's still on the books right now. And then the other thing is a legacy project. When you talked about the governor's legacy, was in the first year of the governor's administration, there was a fire drill, and Commissioner Yaskin jumps on the back of a pickup truck and holds up a report that says the PSE&G nuclear power plant is killing fish every day, and I'm not going to stand for this anymore. I'm going to order the plant to be shut down. Commissioner Weiner comes in, and we say, and was John Weingart really the lead for this, that said, let's take another look at this. let's take a look at this. And the result of that taking a look of it, and was a lot of hand wringing and a lot of work, was BSE&G ended up buying, they thought it would be 23,000 acres, and John made the senior vice president cry at one of the meetings when he told them they had to buy 23,000 acres of salt hay farms in Delaware and New Jersey and rip them out and replace them with productive wetlands, upgrade the intakes for the nuclear power plant, take down 11 fish ladders in both states, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And now you have, and that has survived permit challenge after permit challenge after federal and state legal challenge. And the Delaware estuary is phenomenal. And no one thinks back to, that only came about because of that permit. And that's a real legacy.
And that's quite successful, too.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
PSEG brags about it today.
Yeah, absolutely.
One footnote to fixing the Najipkes program. Dennis did, and I don't know how much this contributed to it, but he pledged to his staff that if they churned out some number of permits by some date, he would kiss a pig in front of the DEP building. And they did, and he did.
But we thought it'd be a big pig with
Yeah.
little cute pork belly.
Stuck to the regulations.
I thought he did it all the time. It was a very cute pig.
It wasn't the first time.
So there are other comments on water quality issues in general, particularly for people who haven't spoken yet, or they don't have to be. We can move on to the next section. Okay, Scott, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, John. So I get air quality and energy. And the context, which I think for me fits through most of our discussion today, the words that come to mind are collaboration and alignment. Governor Florio made it very clear to those of us, their agency heads and others, that the expectation was that we'd be working together to assess and solve problems, and that it wasn't a case of one agency or another, or one issue set or another taking prominence. Of course, that's easy to say and it's difficult to do, but that was the theme with which the administration got launched, and we did our work. And I think it's going to manifest itself in our discussions a few times today. One example is the Pause Commission, which I know is the subject of a later panel, but that was bringing together Commissioner Yaskin and myself and our staffs and other stakeholders, recognizing that the question raised by incinerators was both environmental but also very much energy policy and energy regulation. And the incinerators themselves were not just a way to dispose of waste, but were also a source of electricity, which was, of course, the grand bargain conceived of at the time. And so that had implications on energy policy, energy security, and energy supply, and of course, rate making. And not to make it any less complicated, that was an era, we'll remember, when the PUC, now BPU, regulated the solid waste disposal industry. So we were setting rates for everything from transfer stations to pickup rates, and it was regulated as a public utility. Energy policy, when I took office in early 1990, was a group of people who were housed in another building. And I often describe, many of us will look back to the early mid-'70s when the Energy Division was created following the oil embargo. And between the mid-'70s and, say, the late '80s, 1990, the energy policy in New Jersey is described as a lost tribe of state public policy. It just wandered in the desert for 20 years. And sometimes it was an agency, and sometimes it was a division, and sometimes it was this. And we got it, and it was a division in this other building led by a group of very dedicated people who, for the most part, were ignored and weren't listened to. So they just sat there, and the governor said, "Where's our energy master plan?" And we looked and realized that there hadn't been one in quite some time. So we began to activate that. And of course, the regulation of air issues implicates immediately, as was discussed and as we can think otherwise, the generation of electricity in all of its manifestations. So it was against that backdrop, it was with a passage of a year of experience under the Pause task force, under trying to do the Energy Master Plan, trying to reconcile energy policy, that when the opportunity came and I had the honor of being asked to take on the DEP job, the governor and I began to talk about how do we bring the energy portfolio together with the environmental portfolio and begin to reconcile the policymaking, because there's no art to it. I think from looking at the period from January of 1990 to say November, December of 90, the interaction between the staffs had improved. But we thought it would be much more efficient and far-reaching if we could bring together those policy portfolios, environment and energy, into one department where we had the responsibility as a department to reconcile these issues, take the traditional function of the PUC as rate regulators and say, keep doing that. But now, policy will be this integration work that's done at the department level. So that was the idea, and of course from where I sat, it made enormous sense, and I had the luxury of having Jeanne Fox then as my chief of staff, who worked with me at the PUC, BPU, agreed to come down to Trenton, so I got to say, okay, Jeanne, what do we do? And let me turn it over to Jeanne.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, John reminded me, I have no recollection of this, but before we got there, they were actually thinking about reorganizing in this line. And Lance agrees, so it must have happened because the two of them were both there. But the theory in my mind was, and whoever thought about it initially, if it was Judith or someone else, is that you had people in silos. You had almost 4,000 people in a bunch of silos, and they've been in those silos since they started there, and they've been there for 20 years, some of them. So if you want them to work together, talking to the people in the other silo, and they just didn't do that. So if you break up the silos, you have the person who was in water now in enforcement, and the person who was air now in enforcement, they can work together. So it was really simple, and in fact, when I got to EPA after that, that's what I did at the EPA region as well. It was very effective, I thought, at DEP. I don't know what everybody else thought, but it seemed like people were working well together. And we were trying a lot of new policies, too. We had to do enforcement. It was clear that enforcement, sitting out the violation notices doesn't really count, is what you do, and you needed a real policy that everybody would understand. If they're violating air or water, it's going to be the same enforcement policy, for instance.
The internal reorganization of the department that John mentioned too was something that I think had been in the works, but I remember, John, sitting with you, and it was very early on in my tenure, and I was trying to get a feel for different people and what roles they might play, and I presented the idea of bringing all the permitting activity under one assistant commissioner, and at least this is my recollection of history. John, you said something like, but I don't have an engineering background, to which I said, precisely. How do we bring these activities together in a way that fosters the collaboration and alignment, and we can think about it, and also to bring about accountability. If I can share a personal war story, and I think back at those days, among the things that rise to my list of things I'm proud of were the weekly, I don't know if everybody felt this way, but the weekly meetings that we used to hold to go over every major decision, and this was anybody that's ever had a senior position department knows there comes a day early in your tenure when somebody walks in your office with a big stack of files and says, here, sign this. and you say, okay, but what is it? And that was coupled with an experience I had, again, early on, when an attorney I knew was wandering around the 7th floor of the building, and I said, what are you doing here? And they said, well, I have a closing soon, and I needed a permit, and in an abundance of caution, I called up to make sure the permit that I had negotiated would be ready for the closing, and I was told that it was changed. And I said, well, that makes no sense. Let's go find out what happened. And we convened a meeting, and we had all the permit writers there, and eventually found out what had happened was that one permit writer who had negotiated the settlement, or the permit, went on vacation and said to his colleague, here, can you take this for me? The colleague said, sure, and then read it and said, well, I don't like this. But it wasn't just an individual who was going rogue. It was the department had failed to provide consistent policy and guidance. So people didn't understand what the policies were. And that was part of the charge that John got, that was part of the charge that Ed got and Rick got in his position. And that led to the fact that once a week, anytime somebody wanted to propose a change in rules or the like, or issue a decision, they would come up to the office, and everybody who was relevant would be there, and they had to present their case why this action should take place. Not only did it give me some comfort when I finally put my name on something, but it was a way of infusing alignment and collaboration within the department, and something that carried through.
I would say that Scott, did a little bit of that at the BPU, much smaller agency, right? Like 300 people compared to almost 4,000. But what's really interesting was this meeting happened every week. And I was thrilled with it because when we got in, there was a backlog of all kinds of permitting. Everywhere. Backlog of enforcement actions. And so the DAGs would be there with the relevant assistant commissioners, and there were a lot of items on the agenda, and we sat there and got through it. But they would also bring the directors and maybe somebody else who knew something about the case, because Scott asked a lot of questions. And so it was kind of, Scott could be intimidating way back in those old days. But it was really very good. And what's really interesting, and I don't say this kissing up to my good friend, but Scott would ask questions that nobody had ever thought about on a routine basis. Now, I knew that because he did it at the Utility Commission, but it really cut to the chase and got decisions made. I also just wanted to mention that the reorganization was actually very good for the public and for our customers, because if they needed a permit, there's one place they go. You have the different water permits, but it's under one assistant commissioner. It was much easier for the public to do that. And the accountability was, a little story, Scott talked about the pile of things for him to sign. I think, and you guys might know, I think when it got to the chief of staff or the deputy commissioner, there were like 18 signatures, and Scott was like number 19, something ridiculous like that. So I talked to the assistant commissioners, and I said to him, I don't really care if it's the supervisor, the bureau chief, or whatever position. Only one of them, because nobody read things. I was finding typos, because everybody thought that the guy before him and after him would read it, and some things nobody seemed to ever read. So however the assistant commissioner wanted to do it, so when it got to me, I was like, I don't know what, number 6 or 8 or something like that, but we kept it under 10. That's how bureaucratic DEP was. Also with computers, we brought in Peter Nichols at some point, I guess a year into it. There was all this money being spent on computer systems for all these different types of computers in the different bureaus, not even the divisions, but in the different bureaus, which was insane because they couldn't talk to each other. So we brought in Peter Nichols, who reorganized that. I guess got some money from the governor to do that, but it was quite successful, and thank God it happened, because it was definitely necessary, and a lot of money was wasted before that.
Thinking about the energy portfolio, Rick, I'm going to throw it to you in a second. That's your cue. The energy policy portfolio was placed in the policy office that Rick headed up, Rick Sinding headed up. And around the same time was one of the drivers, the Clean Air Act of 1990 was coming into implementation. And Rick, I wonder if you'd share your observations about having to integrate this portfolio and also how the Clean Air Act amendments played out.
Let me try and put the E of the DEPE into some historical perspective. In 1974, I was the communications director for the then emergency New Jersey State Energy Office. And along with the late Dick DeCourt and Tom O'Neill and Jay Biggins and Roger Schwartz and a handful of other people, formed the first energy task force and made a report to Brendan Byrne like within 2 months, basically laying out New Jersey's energy situation and why we needed to take some definitive position on establishing an energy portfolio, and why it should be its own department, but if it wasn't going to be its own department, it should be a division within an agency that didn't have a vested interest in the outcome of energy policy. It could be a independent, maybe put it in law and public safety, put it in Treasury, just put it somewhere other than the Board of Public Utility, or the PUC. So Brendan put it in the PUC.
That's because you have
And that's exactly right, and because Joel Jacobson wanted it, and Joel was
And who was the first director?
I think it was Bert Ross, that's right, the mayor of Fort Lee who had been wired and yeah, oh my.
Which opened up a seat for me to become a councilman.
See how, it's all, yeah, absolutely. Well, then, it was Pat Dodd who took up the cause and made it got a bill passed that created it as a department. And it was a department for some time, in the late 70s, I guess. And then it sort of degenerated. I don't remember who, I guess Kane moved it back.
Kane basically abolished.
Okay, and moved it back to public utilities. And, yeah, and I always had these ambivalent feelings, I guess because of the fact that I've been involved in that first task force that said, don't put it in PUC, don't put it in DEP, don't put it in any agency, and of course, then I got the portfolio, and so that came full circle. The energy office that came down to Trenton, I have to say, was probably just as dysfunctional there as it had been when it was up in Newark, except that we were able to sort of begin to integrate some of the energy policies that they were playing with Clean Air Act implementation. And the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 were a driving force in much of the activity that the department was involved in throughout the Florio administration. Many of them, I mean, specific ones that we'll get to, the California car, the DMV, and so forth. But I think I'd ask Bill, wherever you are, there you are, who has a long history. He's still doing the SIPs and the TIPs and the state implementation plans and the transportation implementation plans and the.
That's a great segue to the next agenda item. Before you do that, let me just cap off your history of the energy portfolio, at least in my personal experience, which is sometime around before the end of January 1994, after Governor Florio left office and after Governor Whitman was sworn in, our colleague who just mentioned, Peter Nichols, was walking in front of the building on State Street and found a worker there unceremoniously ripping off the letters that spelled out "and energy." And said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I was directed to take it off." He said, "What are you going to do with them?" He said, "Well, I'm going to throw them away." And he said, "Can I have them?" And he said, "Sure." And he then gave them to me. And many of you know they're now mounted on something in my office that says "and energy." But Bill, why don't you pick up the conversational gauntlet and talk about the Clean Air Act amendments?
And there's still holes in the building where that E was. And I grew up in the stationary source side of the air program and permitting assistant director. So actually somebody else reported to you, Rick, John Elston, on the planning side. And but you're absolutely right that in 1990 Clean Air Act, Federal Clean Air Act, started a major planning process for New Jersey, and we developed this monster document called the SIP, the State Implementation Plan, and that set the precedent for the next 20, 25 years. And at that time, there still are. There's 6 national ambient air quality standards, and at that time, we exceeded 4 of them. And I'm proud to say today, we only exceed 1. And that's ozone right now. And the only reason we exceed that is it got more stringent. So the then standard for ozone, we do achieve. The then health standard we do achieve today. And every administration after you as governor contributed, but your administration was the one that started the big planning process that set the precedents for achieving those health standards, and that's quite an accomplishment. Thousands and thousands of lives have been saved as a result of achieving those standards.
Those standards were both stationary source and mobile source.
Right.
And one of the one of the many challenges of creating the SIP, the dreaded SIP, was that we had to model what steps we were well, first of all, we had to do an assessment of how much we were contributing to ozone and particulates and oxides of nitrogen and carbon dioxide, and Bill, you would remember the other.
Lead was one.
Okay,
We
lead.
achieved that before this. That's one of the ones we had.
And we had to quantify how much was coming from stationary sources, primarily smokestacks, and how much was coming from mobile sources, primarily transportation. And then we had to come up with a plan that said, here's how we are going to achieve the standard in each of these areas. Complicating that was the fact that New Jersey was actually part, at that time, Bill tells me now it's only 2 different ozone quality areas?
Air quality control regions.
Air quality control regions, but at that time there was 3. South Jersey was part of the Philadelphia-Wilmington area, North Jersey was part of the New York area, and a slice of Warren and Sussex County was part of the Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton area. And each one was in or out of compliance for each of these substances by a certain amount. Scott was the one who came up with the idea and vigorously supported the idea of the so-called California CAR program. And this was quite a controversial undertaking. The way in which the EPA set it up, there were all these different regions. Each one was, some were in compliance, mostly in the Midwest. Some were out of compliance, but not greatly. Some, like New Jersey, were out of compliance rather substantially. And then, on a whole different level, there's California, which needed to completely reformulate its gasoline, which needed to, so did we with MTBE, and don't get me started on that. And one of the things that California came up with was a program of achieving mobile source reduction by changing the mix of motor vehicles on the road, by requiring that a certain amount of vehicles that are sold in the state be low-emission vehicles, a certain amount be ultra-low-emission vehicles, a certain amount be electric vehicles, far in excess of the standard that was required in other states. New Jersey decided, we decided, the DEP, to push for the adoption in New Jersey of the California car standard, which would probably, I don't know if in and of itself, but it would have come very close to achieving all of the mobile source goals, and in fact exceeded them, but was greatly opposed by the automobile manufacturers, who did not want to be, they were already chafing at having to come up with the mix of vehicles that would be satisfactory in California, but then to have to do that many more low-emission or ultra-low-emission or electric vehicles to satisfy New Jersey, and God knows how many other states who would follow our lead would balk at that. And of course, the Automobile Dealers Association was adamantly opposed. And this fight lasted throughout the administration and was not resolved by the end of the administration. And then there was the dreaded DMV issue, which basically came down to, there were all kinds of programs that EPA was recommending. There were 2 in particular, the IM2 Inspection Maintenance 240. The IM240 would require a car to be placed on a dynamometer for 240 seconds and determine what was coming out of the tailpipe and also evaporative emissions. And then there was the ASM 5015, which also would put a car on a dynamometer and simulate a car going 15 miles an hour using 50% of its energy or something. I don't even remember the details all that much. I'm surprised I even remember the acronyms. And this was a requirement. I mean, EPA, said to New Jersey, you must adopt a new enhanced inspection maintenance system. The Division of Motor Vehicles did not want to do this. And it ended up going, as I recall, to the legislature, where there was a heated debate about whether the DMV was going to adopt it or extremely heated.
Extremely heated. There was a lot of very, very difficult discussions about it, and a lot of time spent joking about how many rotations and why it had to be one of the more unpopular plans that were presented. And by the time it did come to us, it was dead on arrival. I mean, nobody really wanted to deal with it.
Well, the problem for us was that the department had to go back to the EPA and say, we can't do this. The legislature won't let us. And EPA says, well, then you've got to come up with some other way of doing an enhanced inspection maintenance. Well, what other way is there? And of course, you can imagine. I mean, what a nightmare it would have been to have every car in New Jersey that had to go in for reinspection to spend at least 4 minutes of this already interminable inspection system, having to go through this thing. And of course, I guess maybe it was a sort of, I wouldn't say it was a nice moment. There was a fulfilling moment during the subsequent Whitman administration where that whole enhanced inspection maintenance program got them into some considerable difficulty, as I recall. Yes, Parsons. Yeah.
Rick, I think ultimately we did get the we did get the dynamometers.
We did.
On threat of the
Yep.
EPA to take away our highway funds.
Yep.
There happen to be sanctions in the Clean Air Act, which, I think that was the only time that New Jersey, they actually started what they called a sanction clock. And I think we ultimately got whatever legislation we needed, and the rules were adopted the day before we would have been sanctioned.
Now we have no.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, things
Well,
evolve.
but you now
Things evolve.
have all these onboard diagnostics and stuff. The whole system has changed substantially.
Wasn't there that thing that goes in the tailpipe, the ionizer
Yeah,
thing?
they used to put it in.
That some legislators thought it would effectively reduce the,
Oh, you're not talking about the insect device,
The
Gordon
insect.
Bishop
What's it
insect.
called?
Oh, God.
with stainless steel, just fit in there and.
Yeah, right.
It would solve the problem.
Yeah.
Remember, Rick, this led to the pay-as-play law, too. The Parsons.
The Parsons thing, that's right.
We're still dealing with it.
And Rick mentioned stationary sources and mobile sources, and we've done a real good job over the years with the stationary sources, looking at just the power plants where, we are probably, for most air pollutants, in the top 5 for lowest air pollution from our power plants. And that's in part due to the nukes, which supply 50% of our electricity, and natural gas and coal has gone down from 20% to 2%. Renewables are now up to 4% and climbing. So we've done a really good job. We've got one of the cleanest power sectors in the United States. But cars, trucks, still a challenge. We've got so many of them. Even though the cars are cleaner, we're still a California car state. And we have an inspection maintenance system. It's different today, but very important. Even with that, we still got a challenge for meeting the ozone
At
standards.
the time we were promoting the idea of the California car standard, as I recall, Massachusetts had already adopted, and part of our goal was to create a market in the Northeast that would be able to be the gravitational pull for the auto manufacturers and the fuel industry. The other theme that's opening up my head today is being squeezed. And this was being squeezed between the auto manufacturers and the fuel folks and the petroleum industry. It was probably, notwithstanding harbor dredging, one of the more intense debates, so much so, without mentioning names, that one of my son's playmates and classmates was told he could no longer play with my son because true story, because of my position on that subject matter. One of the things it did do, it was an example of the need for interstate collaboration. And of course, we were working with the Northeast states. There was a history of collaboration with organizations like NESCOM and others that Bill and his colleagues had long been involved in. But two themes I want to bring up for people's comment. One was the Ozone Transport Commission. That was part of the Clean Air Act, and it was formed. I served as one of the founding commissioners, each of the states in the Northeast Ozone Transport Commission area had to appoint a commissioner. I can't remember who the second was. But Sue Tierney, a name many of you know, who was then the Environment Commissioner in Massachusetts, and Bob Percisepi, who was then the Environment Commissioner in Maryland, and I and others, Tom Jorling from New York and some others. But I had the real joy about 2 weeks ago of being on a panel with both Bob and Sue. So we got to think a little bit and talk a little bit about the role of interstate collaboration. In that regard, and I can't remember, Rick, I guess you and Jeanne and Bill and others were instrumental in putting this together. We held a regional conference with air directors and energy directors in Princeton. And it was, again, to bring together the counterparts from around the region to think about interstate collaboration in Clean Air Act amendments and cross-state border issues. And what was so striking was there was more than one state where the air director and the energy director really didn't know each other. It was an opportunity for them to meet each other and talk directly. We would talk about how we integrated and created DEPE, and there was a lot of envy in those other states.
Along those lines, OTC, which you
Yeah.
helped found, is meeting today. It's having a meeting today. I think it's down in Maryland. That remains another one of our big problems, the interstate transport issue, particularly from the coal plants in the Midwest, and a challenge that we're slowly being successful at getting those emissions down, but it's taken a long time, and it started in Governor Florio's term.
So why don't we use this opportunity to also just now bring in the issue of mercury standards, certainly part of the topic, and Mary.
Well, at this point in time, I was a policy planner with the department, and I worked for Rick Sinding. And he came to me one day and he said, we're going to do this report and study on mercury, and you are the project manager. Oh,
I believe I asked you, Mary.
I have no science background, but okay, he's my boss. If he wants me to be the project manager, I'll be the project manager. So we pulled together a team, and Bill was our lead scientist on it. And thank God for that, because he did a great job of pulling together the information on what was needed to establish mercury standards. But the report was done in a record number of time. I think we did it in about 6 months, complete, to Rick's surprise.
Delight.
He couldn't believe we were able to get it done. But anyhow, we did it in about 6 months. And one thing that did come out of that was we got the mercury out of the alkaline batteries. And today you can just throw them in the trash. But it was a big issue for trash incinerators with the mercury that was in a lot of waste products. But that report eventually led to state and federal legislation on establishing standards for mercury. And I'll turn it over to Bill for the more scientific background.
And I'd like to thank Mary for great leadership of that first Mercury Task Force. That's the first of two. And I got a little story on air with respect to reduction of mercury from the incinerators. And this happened during the Florio administration. And this is a story about, I actually prepared remarks here. It's not just off the top of the head, so I'll go through these. John said I had up to 5 minutes, is that? All right. Okay. So this is a story about paying attention to a local community, making commitments to solve a clear environmental problem, and then following through. And as you know, we had permitted, before you came into office, a number of waste-to-energy facilities. And the test results were coming in the beginning of your administration. And we had done a pretty good job of requiring best available control technology. I remember myself and a young municipal solid waste planner went to Gary Sondermeyer went to actually went to Germany and to see the Molfenbrenners, that's the garbage incinerators, and the scrubbers they had over there. And as a result of that journey and the pictures that Gary brought back, we required scrubbers on our incinerators. So we thought we did a pretty good job. And emissions for all pollutants were under the permitted levels except for mercury. And why the high mercury? And it turns out that the federal emission factors for mercury were outdated, and there was a lot more mercury in the waste than anticipated. So Mary, those batteries, and
Yeah.
that was part of the problem. And despite the facilities having advanced air pollution controls and several air pollution controls, one after the other, the mercury escaped them all. It's hard to catch mercury. And while we were evaluating these mercury exceedances, a group of concerned citizens in Camden petitioned the department to do a rule to limit mercury. And one of the incinerators is located in Camden. And as you know, rulemaking petitions are few, and few result in action. In this case, it was different in that the petition included a recommended emission limit. The local public had the help of a scientist by the name of Stephen Kravanek. I still remember his name today. He amazed me so. And he provided the calculations for the petition limit. It was a 50 micrograms per cubic meter. And he based it on some new technology that had been put on an incinerator in California, which had this new technology called carbon injection. So we looked at the petition, and we looked at the California test results, and we briefed our commissioner, Scott Weiner, and he gave us the go-ahead to draft a favorable response to the petition. And that was quite exciting for me. You know, you don't get that ability to do that very often. But I'm an engineer, and so I wrote this thing over about 10 times and gave it to Scott, and he promptly gave it to Attorney Marlon Dooley, who fixed it. You talked about engineers before. Well, you were right. The attorneys do a much. And she did it in about an hour. Okay, so Scott then formally committed to do the requested rulemaking, and we proceeded to do technical evaluation and rule development. And the rule was eventually adopted, and in fact, we came up with a standard of 28. You know, it was in two phases, the final standard 28, which was better than what we were asked to do, which was pleasant to actually give the public more than they asked. And it was successful. You know, we were the first in the United States to adopt a mercury limit on municipal waste incinerators. And it resulted in installation of the carbon injection systems on all 5 of our facilities, and they all meet the standard by a wide margin and reduce mercury emissions by about 99%. And that's still occurring today. And what's probably even more important is these New Jersey rules set the precedent for federal rules. And now we have rules across the country modeled after what we did in New Jersey. Not quite as stringent as ours, but good enough. And I think this is a good example of New Jersey being the crucible for regulations that then went national. We didn't stop there. We had the Mercury task forces, the first one led by Mary. And after these task forces, we did more on mercury, hospital incinerators, iron and steel, and coal-fired power plants. And these also spread nationally for the most part. You might be aware of recent federal rules, they call MAT rules, the mercury and air toxic rules, that finally became effective 2 months ago in April. And so all the coal plants in this country need to put scrubbers on for hydrochloric acid and carbon or something similar for the mercury. So therefore, it's appropriate today to be bragging about successful reduction of mercury emissions in the USA, as well as New Jersey, given the big push by New Jersey 25 years ago that started in your administration. And this was all a result of a citizen's petition, the Florio Administration, which listened, committed, and acted. And just yesterday, I saw an article in Science Daily which stated, along the East Coast, mercury levels and rainfall have been trending steadily downward over the last 20 years. So we're actually getting environmental results as a result of these rules. So I'm very proud of the New Jersey air pollution control rules, in particular our leadership on mercury and other air toxics. And I'd like to thank Governor Florio and Commissioner Weiner for the mercury reductions in New Jersey and by precedent in the United States.
Let me add two things to Bill's very excellent report there. One is that the Citizens Committee in Camden that petitioned us was headed by Mark Lobauer, who had been a former Camden County freeholder, who most recently went on to become the chair of the Pinelands Commission, a position to which he was not reassigned or reappointed after he made a certain decision having to do with a pipeline. The other is that we convened a series of meetings of environmentalists, scientists, and the affected community, people who were running incinerators. And I was stunned by the fact that within the second meeting, when Bill came up with his standard of 20, I guess it was 28 at that point, or maybe it was 50, I don't remember which. But
65, then it's 28.
okay, but it was as I remember it, the most stringent mercury emission standard in the world. And I was just stunned that, number one, he came up with it. Number two, the scientists agreed that it was achievable. Mary, who had spent a lot of time looking into how to get mercury batteries out of the waste stream, indicated that it was achievable. The people who ran the incinerators said, we can do this. And I thought, what more can you ask for? Until one representative of the environmental community, who shall remain nameless, said, it's too little too late.
That person's still around?
No, well, I do not know.
In the few minutes we have left in this session, I was just thinking that one day, many years from now, some student somewhere is going to be pulling up this video and is going to think, boy, this is great. There was, the legislature must have just really supported all this. That there was no controversy. And although that around this table are certainly some of the more supportive legislators of that era on these issues, I would invite you to share some of your memories of this era.
Well, I'll begin, and John and Dan can add. I mean, you have to understand the legislature. You haven't sat in a caucus in a long time. I haven't either. I would suspect that it's more raucous. We used to call it the raucous caucus. You never can deal with the legislature and the members and expect them to be happy at all times. And a lot of these things, they have constituents who chase them. Some constituents are very supportive. Then there's other constituents who aren't. And the problem is the ones that are the loudest many times are the ones that are paid attention to. So that is part of the difficulty in dealing with a lot of issues in the environment, and to find that happy medium. And so were always conflicts, whether it be California car. I mean, mercury, to be very honest, was not something we really paid attention to. It wasn't an issue that people in the legislature were paying attention to. They were paying attention to the ones that the public would know about and would be concerned. One of the things that everybody was very happy about was doing away with all the incinerators, because there was a great deal of negative reaction on the part of the legislators, both Republican and Democrat, when that legislation came through in the end of the Kane administration. And so that decision, and then moving forward on that, was a very positive. It was bad for all the developers, the patronage people. They were all not happy, because it was really an internal source of campaign contributions. And a lot of counties had spent a lot of money, including Hudson, and never built an incinerator. So the incinerator issue was very positive. So you have the positive issues, then you have the negatives. The right to know, we talked about, very controversial. So you go back and forth on the issues, but it's never a totally unanimous agreement on any issue in the legislative caucus, whether Republican or Democrat. Somebody always has a problem, and especially on environmental issues, and if they dealt with developers. But some of them, like, nobody was against clean air. Clean water, everybody's for until it comes down to the details. Then everybody has problems.
Joe, let me just say, I mean, that's really the key to successful legislating. Knowing how to be creative enough to be able to get the good parts and the bad parts opposed to each other. For example, on the right to know, one of the things that highlighted support for that bill was finding a child daycare center across the street in Edison, New Jersey, from a factory, putting all kinds of tremendous things there. Mobilizing people understand the good part as opposed to the bad part.
No, you're absolutely right, Governor, and that's where you had to create the balance, and that's how a lot of pieces of legislation, when we were in the majority between 1990 and 91, not only the environment, was to create that balance, and the administration doing that, and then being able to sell it in the caucus.
Yeah, the gun bill was a wonderful example of that.
Yes, the gun bill was a perfect example. And we always thank God for all of the NRA members who, in their nice plaid shirts, who filled the entire State House annex and broke the windows, because that helped to get the votes. So all those things sometimes it's the stupidity of the opposition benefits you a great deal.
I agree with what Joe said to a large degree, that legislators, for the most part, are reactionary across the board, and as opposed to being proactive in certain areas, they kind of react to what the different groups or what their constituents bring them. Unfortunately, you usually have the ones come to you that have the problems, and they haven't been able to get the permit, or DEP is putting them out of business because they're unable to get an answer, and so then the legislator paints as a general across the board, well, they all have to be bad. It was harder to get them to, I think, legislators to focus. I mean, the Maureen Ogdens of the world, who were great in coming forward to having that particular way of dealing with environmental issues and selling selling the story. There certainly were more. I mean, I don't want to sound too negative, but I think there were a lot more proactive environmental legislators on both sides of the aisle then, under the Florio administration, than there are certainly now. And in fact, I haven't been able to find too many at all. But maybe it's because we solved all the problems, but we know better. We all know better. But I think the other thing that you had in the legislature, and while the issues came forward, so many of the environmental issues did not at that time totally revolve around partisanship. And I think that was critical and central to being able to resolve some of the issues that came. When things become so totally partisan, whichever way, R or D, it is much more difficult to build that consensus. And I think we were able to build consensus on many of the environmental issues during that time frame, just because of the individual leaders that were on both sides of the aisle.
And I think that includes the commissioners.
Yes.
Involved, because I remember distinctly, your predecessor in the Kane administration, Bob Huey, was a collaborative. He was just a very collaborative type of individual, and so were you. I mean, you would come and we would sit and we would talk, and if there were issues, we'd try to get at them right away. And I think that process was a process that, certainly the governor can take credit for, but it certainly helped address a lot of issues before they snowballed. The other thing I remember is when you were going through the air permitting issue and some of the other issues that the regulators that you were dealing with, and thank you very much for dealing with them. I'm certainly very appreciative of that. Is at that same time we were dealing with automobile insurance reform, we were dealing with guns, we were dealing with education funding. So we were glad you were there doing your jobs because our focus was certainly on a lot of other things at the time. So, but
a little bit of taxes about that.
Yeah, but I knew you were going to mention that, John. Yeah.
It's interesting, I'm going to think about what Rick said at the beginning about the difference between the era when Tom Kane was governor and the era when Jim Florio was governor. We haven't, in this discussion and thinking about the agenda for this, we haven't talked about land use, which was the dominant part of environment, or at least got the most publicity in environmental protection before and after. But it was that in these 4 years in particular, it got to be how do you implement all these programs. And the example that occurs to me in terms of what you were just saying was when the Freshwater Wetlands Act was signed by Governor Kane, there was a member of the legislature who was in the press event and said, we're really proud that these are the toughest environmental freshwater wetlands regulations, protection regulations in the country. About 2 years later, Jim Florio's governor, somebody wanted to get a permit under the Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act and was denied. And the same legislator said, in any other state in the country, he'd get this permit.
He was probably right in both cases.
Right, he was.
On the topic of land use, one of the things we did was to start the process of recognizing the importance of the Highlands.
Yes.
We established a task force which ultimately resulted in, I guess, started the McGreevey administration, the Highlands program being put in place. And we were trying to do it coming off of, I thought, successful implementation of the Pinelands Preservation Act, trying to replicate that. It didn't really come up to the same standards, but at least it moved in the right direction.
Remember that the freshwater wetlands was one of the few areas you really caught hell for when Bobtail Tufo came out with that interpretation. It allowed a lot of development, and then eventually you pulled back on it. So that remember the
Not yet, but go
maybe you blocked it out, John. But that, you know, one thing I wanted to point out, that one way the governor is unique is there's not many people went into office who had set in motion major laws that he had to implement. Like, I mean, years before he even took office. I mean, I was like walking around dealing with Superfund sites after you sponsored the Superfund law. And I'm down in Atlantic County where they're cleaning up a site that destroyed Atlantic City's water supply. And then he co-sponsored, well, really the first House sponsor of the Pinelands protection. And then later, after being governor, chairs the commission. So not too many governors have been in a position where they pioneered the law and then they implemented. Tom Kean did sponsor CAPRA, so you got to give Tom credit. You know, he implemented that. But you know, that's one way you were distinct from some of the other governors.
I would have implemented more, but I only had 4 days.
Well, you were doing all these.
We did get amendments to CAFRA in the summer of 1993 that Joe Carrillis sponsored. And it was, and that was what you were talking about. It was a wonderful bipartisan initiative in the middle of a campaign.
Right.
And he still did that. Well, why don't we take a break?
So, because I once did solid waste at the Public Utility Commission back in the mid-'80s, Scott made me the solid waste guru. I'm not going to talk too much about it, though other people will, because they spent more time on it. I just want to note, though, that we try to set up processes, too. So we talked about permitting, for instance, and how all the delays when we got there. So because I did solid waste, I pulled in Steve Madonna, the solid waste office people, who had, a lot of them had come from the BPU, or the PUC at the time, and the DAGs involved, everybody involved in the 901 permitting permit that was created in the brilliant legislation passed by the legislature, making us the only state in the country to ever regulate solid waste like a utility. It didn't really work either. But anyhow, so when we got, I forget, it was a backlog of 6 or 7 years, and it had only been in effect for a couple of years. And so I got everybody in the room, including Steve and the deputies and our solid waste people and the permitting people. And I had them diagram at the first meeting. We met every single week on the board how the process works. So they started doing it. And what I said after they did that was quite simple, which is, why don't you, when the permit comes in, make copies of it and give it to everybody else so you can do it at the same time. Anyway, we met for 2 or 3 years at least every week, cut the waiting time for permits from something like 6 or 7 years to like 60 days or so. And that's the type of just practical things that the Florio Administration and Scott did at DEP. But, obviously, there are organized elements, and especially there were organized elements back on the solid waste, which I had some great stories when I was at the Utility Commission, but also at DEPE. And so that obviously played a lot into how we handle things, trying to get people out of the business who should be out of the business and not letting their children or their wives get the business. Really some really interesting stories that some people might want to go into. But I want Scott really to just talk about, and then we have some real experts here who lived this. From his perspective, being in the cabinet and working with the governor, why this was so important and the big picture on it.
That's what the introduction means.
That's it.
I've been trying to figure out, with some confession, I took a look at the agenda, I said, what am I supposed to introduce? And now I just got my cue, and speaking of cues, Lance, when you do ECRA to ISRA, I assume the voluntary cleanup program, We'll be in there? Or will be now?
Will be now.
I remember that phrase.
And one of the phrases Jeanne used was common sense, and all of us who had a chance to work with the governor knows that this was often the deciding factor, what made sense, and to try and strip away all the rhetoric and all the hoopla and figure out what makes sense. So when we take a look at this issue set, ECRA to ISRA is one that I'm sure Lance will spend a lot of time on. A related initiative was the voluntary cleanup standard under ECRA. Both of these was enormous in terms of common sense, I think, is why it was important. It was something that was needed. It was something that Lance played a very important role in helping formulate it. Former Senator McNamara, no longer with us, was our partner in this. I'll say that I knew Hank McNamara from my days in Bergen County. And some of you know that before I came to the administration, I had a very short-lived run to try to become the Democratic nominee for county executive in Bergen County. And I got two things from working with Hank. One was a pen. When the bill was signed, he just gave me a pen. Wasn't a governor's pen, it was a pen. I got the governor's pen from the governor. And the other was, he said, if I had known about you then, I would have supported you for county executive.
And I knew that Hank Barrett, he was a Republican.
Yeah, for those of you in the future who are watching it. The pause, again, we'll spend some time talking about that, and we've talked about it in the context of collaboration, but it was just common sense. Anybody who stopped and thought for a minute about why 22 incinerators. Speaking of, for those of you who were in the department back in the 80s, if you were involved, I remember being an attorney in practice then, and the state solid waste management plan said, well, here's the way we'll do it. We'll just punt it all to the counties, and of course, as was pointed out, the counties saw this both as an act of responsibility and a wonderful way to raise money, which was done. Yeah, recycling, not just another common sense initiative, it was something that existed before the pause. The pause really brought out, in my mind, among other things, the importance of recycling as a core principle. This was a core policy. This had to do with how we were going to live our lives as a society. Source reduction also came in, and that before we talked about any disposal method, we need to be talking about these issues. And incinerator regionalization, again, relates to the pause, and we'll have some interesting conversations about that. When I saw all the talk about incinerators, I reminded that as we were dealing with the pause, and the pause is over, I was now at DEP, I was dispatched out to Union County to address a group of protesters. Gino started to see it. And I get out of my car, and I'm greeted by all the protesters, one of whom was holding a sign, which is a big Frankfurter with my face at the top, with the phrase, "Weiner, don't roast our future." Which I thought was great. It ended up in the Ledger the next day, and I used to hang it on my refrigerator so to teach my kids to have a sense of humor about the last name that everybody in our family, particularly the males for generations, have had to deal with. So with that, Lance, you're up.
Before I move into ECRA to ISRA, just something that has struck me, and the governor, I'll see if you remember this. One, it was difficult to run the site remediation program with Mr. Superfund as your governor. Okay? So, just a little bit of pressure there. But one of the pleasures I had was taking the governor out to the Woodland Township Superfund site, which we were cleaning up, the Woodland Township site is in the Pinelands industry, and its desire to make a buck. Just brought backhoes in, dug trenches in the sand, and brought the tanker trucks in and dumped the liquid waste right into the ground. And of course, it leached into the groundwater and created quite a mess. And we were cleaning that up for quite some time. But the governor wanted to come out and see one of our sites in action, getting cleaned up, and it was a pleasure to take you out there to do that. ECRA to ISRA. I suggested this topic to John not just because it was an important piece of legislation, but for how it came about and the interactions that we've talked about today of people and how important that was in getting this legislation to happen. ECRA, for the record, is the Environmental Cleanup Responsibility Act. It was sponsored by Senator Dalton and I think enacted in 1985. As many programs at DEP, its initial implementation was a disaster, and there were calls in the latter 80s for its repeal and just get rid of it, failed experiment. And what ECRA requires is industrial sites to show that they are clean before they can be sold. Great concept, fantastic concept. The way the department initially went about implementing it, not so good. We made changes in the late 80s from 1986 on to change how the program was being implemented and really stood the program on its head in terms of how an environmental agency would approach a problem. The way it was first implemented was, geez, we got to focus on these sites that we're finding that are contaminated. And they were badly contaminated. And all the staff was working on those sites. And it was just creating a tremendous backlog. We changed that and said, we need to have different groups of people working on different parts of the process. So if somebody has a clean site, they're not held up by this. And those changes saved the program. And so when the governor was elected and took office, there weren't calls in the legislature to repeal the statute anymore. And we had Democratic control of both houses, so we were safe. Everything was going well. We were moving forward, implementing it. Scott came up with the idea of the voluntary cleanup program to let people start the process early.
Well, actually, it was your idea.
Was it?
Yeah.
All right.
You can take credit for it.
Okay. So the way this got started, as I recall, at least my memory, is I remember getting a call from you one day, and you said there was a developer, whose name I don't recall, because the program was really administered as an enforcement proceeding, so you were somewhere in a queue. And when you got high enough in the queue, then you had to deal with the department's enforcement staff, and you could get your property cleaned up and signed off. So Lance calls and says that there's a developer who eagerly wants to develop their property, and they're willing to pay for everything and develop it to any standards that we set. They'll voluntarily do this if we will expedite the cleanup. And as I recall, you and I had a discussion that said, why wouldn't we do that? Why would we force them into the queue? And that gave birth to the voluntary cleanup program, which was the first time that somebody could raise their hand and say, you tell me what to do, give me clear standards, I'll pay for it, I want to get my property back in the market.
I have a recollection about the Singer facility, Singer sewing machine in Perth Amboy. I think that was the one.
Wait, you guys members are better. I remember both of you, so I'm in trouble here. All right. So why was ECRA then important as we went through into the second half of the administration? Well, of course, something happened in November 1991 that we don't really want to talk about, and that's the legislation changed, and we now had veto-proof majorities in both houses that were Republican. And
you don't have to say it like it's a bad.
It will be if Trump gets elected. Sorry, I couldn't resist that one. Okay, so the issue had shifted now. It was no longer the department's implementation, but it's what we had talked about earlier, and that is the costs of these programs and the department's different standards and different approaches. When at this point in time, I had 750 people working for me. And the question is, all in different programs, but cleaning up sites. And the question was, well, what standard gets applied here? What do we have to remove the stuff? Can we leave it? All these questions were being focused on. And the legislature, now led by Senator McNamara, unfortunately passed, comes in and says, we're going to amend ECRA. Scott calls me into his office to tell me this and goes, Lance, the legislature is going to amend ECRA. Here's your mission. Get the best bill that you can, but the governor will sign whatever the legislature passes.
I don't know if I said that.
You don't remember that?
That's way back in
Okay, all right. See, there's certain things that... So, Senator McNamara, now it just so happens, here's where the interesting personalities come to be. Scott mentioned he was from Bergen County. He was from Wyckoff in Bergen County. I grew up in Wyckoff. I bought my first Ford Mustang from Senator McNamara's car dealership. Okay? So I made sure that I told him all these things. And so Senator McNamara started working on this legislation and worked on it and worked on it. Now, during this time, he had a hip replacement. I would go up to Wyckoff for meetings with him in his house, in his bedroom, with him up in traction, recovering from his surgery. He spent over a year working on this legislation. And one of the final issues that we had to deal with was, what should the legislature say about cleanups? Now, no offense, Senator Dalton, but Senator McNamara asked me, he goes, Lance, what's your biggest problem with ECRA? And I told him, I said, it's a great piece of legislation, but I don't know what it wants me to achieve at each individual site, because the statute said clean up the sites to the maximum extent practicable. Well, that to me left a lot of interpretation. And Senator McNamara agreed, and he said, okay, we're going to address that. So Senator McNamara convenes a meeting. He goes, Lance, we're gonna have a meeting, we're gonna talk about this. Come over to the State House. And I arrive, and at this meeting is Hal Bozarth and about 5 scientists from DuPont, Chambers Works. And we proceed to go through what the statute should say about a cleanup standard. And I argued that it needed to say, we're going to clean up sites to a 1 in a million cancer risk, because that was the federal standard. And I said, if we don't do that, we take the risk of having all these sites potentially subject to a subsequent federal action. And that would be terrible for business. We also said that we were willing to allow encapsulation of contamination rather than dig up and haul to some other location. And the reason for that was the 1 in a million cancer risk was all based on exposure. So if we could eliminate exposure, which is something we were already implementing, so this was an easy give to put into the statute, it would significantly lower the costs. So those were my arguments. Of course, industry didn't agree with that, and they were arguing for a 1 in 100,000 standard. And we went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, Senator McNamara said, okay, I've heard enough. I'll let you know my decision in a couple of days. And he called me up a couple of days later and said, Lance, your arguments made phenomenal sense. You did a great job in that meeting. And I don't mean to sit there and pat myself on the back, but he goes, it's going to be as you proposed it. And that's how the statute got written. That's how the 1 in a million cancer risk became law. I'm not as good as my friend here at Neafsey who remembered the exact date of when you signed that bill, but it was in 1993, the spring. I do remember the location, though. It was on the Passaic River, and here's why I remember it so well. I went up early to make sure the site was fine, there weren't going to be any environmental issues that would be available, and I noticed some drums on the site, and I said, oh my God. I'm lucky I was a young man at the time, because if I did this now, I probably would have died of a heart attack, because I go by one of the drums, and all of a sudden, there's this big commotion and splash, and I look in, and there's this enormous snapping turtle that the workers had taken out of the Passaic River, and were obviously going to use for supper that night, stuck in one of the barrels. So that was, I left that alone, and we went to the signing, and...
I thought you freed the turtle.
No, I did not. Yeah, you would- yes, Jeanne, you would have. And that's how the Industrial Site Recovery Act then came into being.
That's another
And-
effort of bipartisanship and
Yep.
working together for the good of New Jersey.
Yep. And there's just one last thing of how effective that statute was, along with the rest of our cleanup programs. I did a lot of work with the Association of State and Territorial Solid Waste Management Officials, at SWAMO, as its nickname is known. Gary knows it well. And they had the hazardous waste programs were part of that association. And they convened a study of how many sites the different states had cleaned up at that time. And this was in the early 90s. And New Jersey had cleaned up more contaminated sites by that date than the next 8 states combined, including California, New York, all these other states. And Senator Dalton, it was mostly because of ECRA.
The Cynic would ask if New Jersey had 8 times more contaminated sites than...
Well, no,
we were finding them.
Yeah.
We were finding them because it was now a condition of business, of a business transaction, which, although it didn't trigger the same legislation in other states, it triggered it as a commercial business practice driven by the attorneys that now said, yeah, this is an issue that has to be dealt with. Look at what's going on in New Jersey. These sites are contaminated. You know, it's strict joint and several liability. You buy this thing, you know, without investigating, you're going to inherit the liability, and
It makes sense. And in the 80s and the 90s, the Democrat Republicans in New Jersey, most of them were environmentally oriented. And they worked together for the good of the state, which hopefully will happen again. Let's go on to, and obviously, when you have the governor who actually wrote the Superfund law because the state had an issue, it was significant pressure on the department to get it right. And Scott always talked to him about it, and I'm sure he knew more about Superfund than you did. Okay, we'll go on to the pause. And again, solid waste, I was a solid waste person, and the pause was really very interested. Gary, as you all know, was at one point deputy commissioner or chief of staff.
Chief of staff.
Chief of staff. Well, I was both. There was a chief of staff, and then there was a deputy commissioner. We didn't have two. But anyhow, go ahead, talk about this, because the pause is an interesting thing. Government frequently doesn't like to pause.
Right. No, it was a fascinating time. Commissioner, you kind of teed it up well in your introduction. And, you know, solid waste has always been the wild, wild west. And to sort of paint the picture, I started at DEP in 1980, and one of the first things I was involved with was doing an open dump inventory. And we found 630 open dumps in the little state of New Jersey. So every single town, all 567 had a dump, and a few were special and had 2 or 3. So we got this landscape of 630 dumps. Our legislature kind of recognized in 1975 and said, you know, towns can't do this. They really can't. It's got to be regional. Waste has got to be managed regionally. So we're going to do the simple thing, logically, administratively, push it up to the 21 counties. And you know what? There's so much garbage up in the Meadowlands. Let's make them a special district. So we had the Hackensack Meadowlands Development Commission. And the entire focus, the freeholder boards did not want to do this. Kicking and screaming, and you know, public policy was a different time, and the department really took a leadership role in calling freeholder boards in and reading them the Riot Act. You gotta cite facilities. And of course, what do the freeholder boards do? They hire consulting firms. And the consulting firms look at, well, what's the state of the art for waste management? Every single one of them looked at West Germany. And what was the state of the art was building mass burn incinerators. So we wind up through this county planning process with these freeholder boards making really hard decisions to site waste facilities. And in fact, 19 of the 21 counties cited specifically an incinerator site.
Who did not?
And 15 cited landfill sites. 34 major siting decisions. And you kind of had to be there. I was at a lot of these hearings. They were bloodbaths. I mean, thousands of people throwing vegetables, fist fights between freeholder boards. It was crazy. But they cite all these facilities. And then, lo and behold, in 1987, Governor Kane signs the Mandatory Source Separation and Recycling Act. So let's think about that for a minute. We just spent 10 years with an exclusive focus on building environmental infrastructure at tens to hundreds of millions of dollars, and now we just passed a law to take as much of the stuff you got to feed the garbage plant away as you possibly can. Think about that one. So Rick said, I thought you just nailed it earlier. In the 80s, we had a lot of very popular environmental initiatives and these major landmark laws put into place, but then in the 90s, you had to implement them. So here, how do you deal with this dichotomy of building all these major facilities and then taking all the waste away from what you got to feed in? And Commissioner, you kind of used the term of using common sense, bringing common sense in. So on April 6th of 1990, Governor Florio is in office not very long. He signs Executive Order number 8 and establishes the Emergency Solid Waste Assessment Task Force. And it was called, appropriately, the Pause. And that's really what it did. It said, you know what, our public policy has kind of gone amok. It was a good idea what the legislature said, let's take it away from the towns, give it to the counties, but we didn't watch that process. And that process kind of got out of control. We don't need 34 major solid waste facilities built in this state. So this executive order basically said for 120 days, we're going to stop everything, shut it down, nothing's going to happen, nothing's coming out of DEP on all these different projects. And we put together a task force, and President Weiner was at the table, Commissioner Yaskin at the time, the environmental community, county governments, private sector entities, other state departments, and we all got in a room like this and used a great term earlier, the raucous caucus. Yes. It was a raucous caucus. And it was a significant amount of knockdown, drag-out fighting, outright fighting of what the policy should be. And God bless the environmental community for coming in for the first time, really, in a serious way, of saying we have to look at not producing waste in the first place. Source reduction. We had never systematically looked at source reduction. Secondly, we have to maximize recycling. Third, if we're going to build anything, let's look at opportunities to regionalize. So we don't have 34 things, we have something that makes, back to your point, common sense. And the net result of those discussions, I have to point them out, the architect of how we designed the recycling rates, which to this day are the statutory recycling rates in this state 26 years later, was Frank Sweeney. And Frank actually came out to the Division of Waste Management and spent a tremendous amount of time, and we actually went through every, what's that? You hated every minute of it. Too much time. Because we didn't get it, actually, to be honest with you. Yeah. But we systematically, honestly, took apart the waste stream. We went through every single county composition study, 34 different commodities, and did legitimate regression analysis and other statistical ways of determining what is a feasible recycling rate. So this was not a willy-nilly, pull it out of the air public policy, let's pick a number. We actually calculated those numbers, and we came out with two numbers, 50% of the municipal waste stream, 60% of the total waste stream, and went forth and actually once again drove public policy with your leadership and had every one of the 21 counties come back with 50 and 60% recycling plans, regionalization plans, and sort of the legacy to it to me is we put together, actually I'm probably the only human that still has these things. We did this incredible solid waste plan. And we did, if you remember, the wash-ups of the regulated medical waste on the beach. How can anybody forget? The state's first comprehensive regulated medical waste management plan. And to our discussion about water quality earlier, the state's sludge management plan. And these documents were absolutely the most transformational documents I ever had the honor of having a small part of being involved with. And to fast forward, and I'll finish, the legacy of all this in my mind is the recycling goals that we established with your leadership were the highest goals in the United States of America, and we still haven't achieved them, which is pretty fascinating in terms of the drive, or perhaps lack of drive, consistently to the goal of the public policy to achieve them. And our latest numbers are 58% of the total waste stream, 43% of the municipal waste stream, so we still have a ways to go. And in terms of infrastructure, we did build 5, as Bill pointed out, 5 mass burn incinerators, all of which have operated, frankly, up to spec since day one. And we built 12 double composite line landfills. So we built a statewide infrastructure, which is still in place, and every one of those facilities is still operating. But more importantly, we didn't build the 14 other incinerators. And to this day, we are still paying off the debt for the 5 incinerators we did build. Can you imagine if we built all those facilities?
That's just such a wonderful example of what we talked about at the beginning of this session, saying that we're going through this not for just nostalgic purposes, but to try to learn for future purposes. Let me shift to gas pipelines. We're now in the process of building 12 or 13 new gas and oil pipelines. And this is to transport natural gas. But we also know that the nation has a task of reducing reliance upon fossil fuels, including gas going forward. I've tried to make the argument to the pipeline industry, think about overcapacity, buying into something you're going to have to pay off, when in fact the stock of the materials you're supposed to put through the pipelines is going to be inevitably reduced. At some point you build a bubble and then you have to bail out. So I mean, this is a wonderful example of what we saw in the past that should be applied to the future.
Right example.
But whether anybody applies it or not is still up in the air.
What was the driving force behind the pause, though? Was there a particular?
I'll go back to the commissioner's talking about common sense. Really, I think it was, our
Just,
public policy has gone out of control, right, Commissioner?
Yeah, it really came from the governor. I mean, of course, the environment at the time was counties who were promoting it. There were some counties that had a vested interest in promoting it. There was industry promoting it. There were environmental groups that were pushing against it. It was raucous, to use that phrase. And it was common sense to say, let's just step back and pause and make an assessment, because this doesn't make sense on its face. And that led to the task force.
When I was at the Utility Commission as a deputy director, Essex County moved pretty quickly on their waste energy facility, or incinerator as we call it. It was very much an environmental justice issue. They put it in Down Neck, which is a low-income, poor neighborhood. I now will admit for the first time publicly that I was the deputy director, and I had hired an economist lawyer to work on this full-time, and a couple other people. And our recommendation to the commissioners, who will go nameless, was not to approve it. Not because it might not work technically, although there were questions, but that was a DEP issue, but because economically the Essex County tax holders would be on the line if there were problems. And the commissioners went along with it anyway because it was political, and they approved it, and it was cited there, and there was some real problems. And economically, the taxpayers could have had a problem, but also so that was an issue that I knew quite well about. Scott knew about it, and we really didn't need those fights all over the country because of source reduction, which is what you should do first, obviously, would then lead to not for the need. So it was very much for the governor and Scott an opportunity of being practical about this and not putting in facilities that we didn't need if we did the right thing by recycling and source reduction. And so it made complete sense to do what we did. It was really another example of the governor's leadership on how to do the right thing for the state in the least costly manner but get a better result.
Thinking of lessons learned, there was, besides all the usual suspects who were involved in it, maybe these were usual suspects also, just remember that the finance industry was also very engaged in this. And the reason I knew something about it was because at that point I was a bond lawyer and was involved in a couple of the financing of a couple of the transactions. But through it all, I mean, when you're inside the bubble, you have one perspective. And what the governor did was create the environment for us all to step back and say, this doesn't make sense. Let's take the pause. And the reaction to source reduction for those of us that were in the room, was at first that this was just, I mean, what's this wild idea? Let's deal with something practical. But it began to take hold, and it was really the strength of the commission, of the task force that the governor put together, and the diversity in that room that brought about the result.
So there were a couple other factors also. New Jersey wasn't operating in a vacuum. There was a big crisis on the East Coast.
Yes.
All the big cities, New York and all, were shipping all their garbage to Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio. And there was a big backlash from those states. And everybody knew deep down that when it got to the Supreme Court would probably strike down any attempts to ban. But there were all kinds of other pressure. People were inspecting trucks and doing all kinds of things to harass the industry to prevent this waste from going to landfills elsewhere. So New Jersey was under tremendous pressure, and this was being used to justify a lot of the public policy, somewhat understandably. The other thing that's not on the list here is the other big solid waste bill that the legislature worked with the administration on was the solid waste dereg bill. Because this whole waste flow, this whole rate regulation system had been put in place, and it was designed to basically put the hooks on the garbage to feed the burners. So, you know, you put your trash on the tree lawn, a big hand would appear and would grab it, and off it would go to the incinerator. So that whole system had to be dismantled, but it had to be done in a responsible way so that we could deal with organized crime and other industry concentration, other kinds of economic issues that affected. So I think that was another significant accomplishment, because it was basically a way of getting the private sector really back involved in waste management in the state by saying, you know, New Jersey's open for business. We want you to come in, we want you to make investments, because we want legitimate business to be handling the trash in the state and making sure it's getting to the right place and not being dumped somewhere.
One of the names that's not mentioned, who's not at the table today, because it couldn't be here, Steve Gable.
Right.
Steve, maybe you recall, was the director of the Division of Electricity at the PUC BPU. And when we came in, the position of the director of solid waste at the PUC was open. So I felt we needed a really good finance person, somebody with a good economic background to head that up because of the issues Frank mentioned. So I asked Steve if he would take it on. He thought he was being punished. And I said, no, it's really important. This is going to lead us to deregulation and like. And so he did it. There was a utility executive who thought that he was a communist because of his rate making, and thought that we did this for him, for his company. But Steve was very effective in leading us down that path, both rationalizing the regulation when we had it and then getting us deregulated.
And we did merge the PUC solid waste people basically in with the DEP solid waste people, which was a good way, because I mean, Mike Winkler was in there at DEP, but we brought some decent people too, so.
Jeanne, I think it was important that you raised the environmental justice issue with regard to that siting of that facility in Newark, because at least during the early 90s, there were a lot of problems,
And also the
air
South
pollution
Campus.
problems.
Yeah.
We had
Union
That was a
County.
big issue.
significant enforcement actions. I remember one in 1992, $400,000 for air pollution against them.
And as you know, incinerators don't really have that many jobs, so locating them in the Ironbound or locating them in South Camden doesn't really present a lot of jobs, but it does present pollution. Now today, they're burning much hotter, but back then they weren't burning hot enough, and there was definitely some impact on the communities surrounding them, and there were a lot of people living around them. So that was another good reason for the pause, to actually think this thing through and not just cite these things where the people who can't defend themselves as well live.
Or as close as possible to the border with the next county.
Well, that's what the, yes. Okay, so why don't we move on to what came out of this? Actually, you want to talk about how the recycling came out of this?
Yeah, and Mary's really going to, I think,
Mary
address as,
Mary
our
Shield
expert
is
on
the
recycling.
recycling queen of New Jersey.
Yes,
Has always
absolutely.
been and will always. She did we had the best recycling in the country for years because of this. And unfortunately, because we didn't have a second term, the plans that we had were kind of toned down a bit. But when Mary...
Well, to tell, Gary was doing the work in 1980 down in DEP. The first Recycling Act came out of the Department of Energy under Governor Byrne. And that was the voluntary recycling act. But the whole goal of that was to go into mandatory if it worked on a state basis. And we said, yes, this does work on a state basis. And that's why we went to mandatory in 1987 in the Kane administration. So, and then we had the pause, which took the rate. I think the rate at that time in 1990, when Governor Florio signed the executive order, was about 40% of the total waste stream. The recycling rate, and then the recommendations of the task force was to go to 60% of the waste stream. But this entailed bringing in other stuff, construction, demolition waste, which then brought in the need for regulations, because we found that a lot of people would use, recycling facilities were not regulated. There weren't regulations for them. They operated as sort of private facilities. And as long as they were only taking paper, metal, and glass, and plastics, it seemed to work. But when you start to get in with C&D waste, construction, demolition waste, and other types of waste, then we got those in who were trying to bypass the system. And they were using recycling as a way to manage solid waste. And we had a lot of problems. In fact, I think this really happened in Kane administration, where you had a facility in Newark, and they were bringing in waste from New York, and it was supposedly a recycling facility. And we at DEP, we had worked with the Attorney General's office. I don't know how many times we went to court to try to get them, that place shut down, and we got getting thrown out of court. And finally, one day, I don't know if you were with me, Gary, we walked with the judge through the site and explained to him why it wasn't a recycling facility. Yeah, it was, and there were rats running in front of us. I mean, it was awful. The judge came back and he denied us. He said he saw too many poor people working there and we would put them out of a job. And we were like, about 4 days later, that place went spontaneous combustion. It caused several $1 million worth of damage to Interstate 78 and almost shut down Newark Airport.
Hub recycling.
Yeah, and then that judge also lost his seat on the Superior Court. But so we finally got it shut down. But that's what we were dealing with. What?
You blew it up?
Don't tell them that.
We had to go up and clean it up.
Yes, yeah, and then it had to be cleaned up.
And people went to jail.
So that's what you had people who were really operating illegally under the guise of recycling. So then we had to put in all these regs. And today we have a facility like Gary operates that does handle C&D waste and that other type of waste in an environmentally sound manner and a legal manner.
I think to that point, sort of another legacy item, when we first started to regulate the recycling world to make sure that it was done properly,
Right.
I think we did things properly. But we weren't very imaginative. We named our facilities A, B, C, and D. So, Class A is curbside stuff that we all put out in front of the house, and we really didn't regulate very much. You just had to go on a county plan, and that was appropriate to keep the free market. But once you get beyond that, you can get into some shenanigans. But the good news is Class B recycling facilities, which take concrete, asphalt, brick, block, and soils, there's 122 of them operating in the state today. I think that's fantastic because you have a built infrastructure, you have appropriate competition, you have appropriate government oversight, and it is done properly. And it really stemmed out of these plans and what came out of that in terms of environmental regulation.
I remember prior to some of these things happening, we had whole industries of waste oil taking chemicals and selling it to people for home heating.
Yep.
Right.
Absolutely. Yep.
In the
You
name
know
of
them well.
recycling.
Because some of the enforcement guys talk about, because obviously the organized elements were very involved. I have some great stories from when I was at the PUC, and a few from DEP. But why don't you guys, DEPE, but tell us a few stories about how we tried to get the guys, and in fact get a lot of these guys out of the business.
Well, in solid waste fields, I think of Zuccarelli, which was under Commissioner Weiner. I mean, he was completely shut down and put out of the business.
And Chris Grunga, who we just raised, it was him and his father were quote-unquote waste oil recyclers in Burlington County, and they were taking it in one end, charging the people to take it in, pumping it directly out into a tanker that was then going to New York City schools to be burned in the heating plants in New York City schools.
Right.
And we had tried to get Frank, his father, a couple of times unsuccessfully.
Well,
and
the
then-
Grungos were on everyone's radar because they were persistent scofflaws
They were
of
persistent
environmentalism.
Yeah.
So that's how that case started.
That's
how
right.
they were targeted. To go back to Hub
Yeah.
for a second, as I said, there were a number of people who went to jail. Some of those sentences were significant, 15, 18 years, but there was a deputy police chief who was paid off, and that kind of allowed things to get out of control at that site. And he went to jail for 10 years, too.
Don't know how many of you remember that Michael Aaron's then brother-in-law wrote a song, a takeoff on Billy Joel's "We Didn't Start the Fire," and the opening line was, "We didn't start the fire. It was Hubble Recycling, but they weren't recycling."
Another example is in Pennsylvania, adjacent to the border, there are a number of cement kilns. Cement kilns were unregulated as the hazardous waste incinerators are regulated under the RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And so what was happening, all the wastes were going to the cement kilns, which were legally able to burn them, notwithstanding the fact didn't have regulations. So a lot of us got involved in trying to change the regulations so as to close the loophole for cement kilns.
I think we already talked about the incinerator regionalization, so I think we're.
But I just am curious about the medical waste.
Medical waste.
Because that was such a big issue, and I remember we got blamed with planting it out on the beaches because nobody would. No, others. But it was such a really amazing issue that made national news. And what were some of the findings there, and how did you all ultimately regulate it with the governor's leadership? And
The medical waste issue did prompt very significant rulemaking very, very quickly, along with statutes both in the state and regionally. And we wound up with a registration program for all generators of regulated medical waste: doctors, dentists, podiatrists, funeral homes. I mean, I seem to remember 45,000 generators that we identified.
That's where the color coding started.
Yeah,
it's remarkable that
across the state.
wasn't regulated at all, before that.
Well,
No.
the 88 beaches, I mean, I had a place in Brigantine, I would walk with a big bag and pick
Yeah.
up all this stuff, right? And people had to shut down the beaches. So it was very clear one of the things we started pretty early on was just that. And basically, it's a system that's still used today.
It's still in use today. Put in place a manifest for tracking cradle to grave from generator, transporter, disposal facility, packaging requirements, double packaging, labeling. The truck has to have a certain size letter that denotes that it's got regulated medical waste in it. Any facility that deals with it has to both treat and destroy, which is the only regulation like that in the United States of America. And what that really means is you have to treat it, which you can do through a steam sterilization technology like an autoclave or others, but you also have to grind it to half-inch minus to destroy it. And all that really does is avoids any potential for needles on a beach.
Yeah. So that was very cool, and we did it in a fairly short time, all of this. I mean, it was pretty impressive. Who did that? Who spent all the time on that?
Internally, the Division of Waste Management.
That's right.
Yeah.
State
Yeah, he was
senator,
the senator.
state senator. right.
No one could comprehend that it was coming out of the outfall pipes.
Exactly.
And washing down, right?
Right,
And that's
right,
why people are blaming others. Everyone thought there was someone out on a boat dumping it, and
Right.
it's coming onto the beach, but that wasn't the case. And it took a while.
Right.
It took a while to learn that.
And I think our state police and the Attorney General's office did investigations. They
Yes.
tracked material going through. They found greasy substances on the syringes coming through combined sewer overflows and going right out into waterways. That's what I recall.
Division of Criminal Justice
Yeah,
did
Division of
issue
Criminal
a
Justice,
report.
yeah.
And that the problems, and it was a national news story. The problems were significant because of how important tourism is to the state's economy, but it led to the formation of the beach wash-up response teams that
Yes,
are
right.
in place so that when things come in,
Floatable action plan, I think
everyone
it's
is
called.
notified. DEP is notified, criminal justice is notified, the local county health officer is notified.
So that medical waste is important, and I just wanted to raise two bills that the governor signed that probably the legislature don't remember. They were very small bills. They weren't like the Water Enforcement Act or ISRA. One was the Dry Cell Battery Management Act that you signed, and the other was the Toxic Packaging Reduction Act. Both small bills, but now very important. Both of those said, in the solid waste plan, they said, we're going to do this source reduction, and we're going to have a couple of incinerators. And they realized that these metals that you're putting in products stay in the waste stream when you throw these things away, and when you burn them, they end up in the ash or they end up in the airstream. And we have to take these things out. And those were the first bills in the country where they were saying, we want to take these things out of products in the front end so we don't have them on the back end. And issues that you're seeing today, product manufacturers were absolutely opposed to this, didn't want to do this. They had playbooks on how not to do this. But now you see the actually reverse. They brag about our products are now safe. We don't have things in our product. And that was the first done in the Florio administration in that Dry Cell Battery Management Act. Said you had to take mercury out of alkaline batteries. You had to take metal, cadmium out of batteries, and you had to take cadmium out of the packaging that we did. So very important, very small bills. You may not remember them, but extremely important in terms of cleaning up the environment, those toxic metals that are no longer residue in the environment today. So
the same concept, by the way, applies to sewage sludge. Pre-treatment of the sewage sludge
same issue.
Will take the heavy metals out of the sludge because you've treated it, taken them out before you treat them.
Or even one step up, take it out of the product, so you don't have it in the sludge, and you don't have it in the wastewater. So.
We're going to need to move on to the fourth category, which is other environmental initiatives, which is appropriate to have Rick's name there because that was basically his job. But first, pollution prevention in the great reorganization. Bill, the way the department's organized now is, in terms of permitting and enforcement, is largely the way it was from that reorganization. Is that right?
Enforcement is still all together, but permitting and planning is back together again. So instead of having three functional segments, there are two functional segments.
One part of it was to include pollution prevention with environmental regulation, which was not Gene Herb's first choice, but.
No.
That's true. So I've had the opportunity to have 2 tours of duty at New Jersey DEP. I started in 1985 under Commissioner Huey in the Office of Cancer and Toxic Substances under Tom Burke's mentorship. And my job was and then I stayed until 96 and returned under Governor McGreevey in 2002 and then left under Governor Christie in 2010. Well, let's be honest, I was asked to leave. So when
That's a badge of honor, right?
So when I first came in, my job was to help pull together the outcome of the 1979 Industrial Survey, which was revolutionary, quietly revolutionary. It was done only through regulatory authority under the general powers of the department, in which manufacturing facilities were asked to report what kinds of chemicals they use and what do they do with them. And this was a long time ago, before a period before now disclosure. And so those companies said what kind of chemicals they use and what did they do with them. And it had never really been written up. And so my job was to write it up. What came out of that was a keen understanding of dumping, illegal dumping, which led to some of the laws that Lance then picked up. It also led to an understanding of how many of the companies were treating chemicals at the end of the stream, but not looking to see how they could reduce at the beginning. It led to the 1983 Worker and Community Right to Know Act, and I had the opportunity to work on the implementation of that act, which then became the model for the Federal Toxics Release Inventory. All of that led to a conversation about Now what do we do to try to encourage companies to reduce their use and generation of hazardous materials at the beginning, at the source? And that led to the Pollution Prevention Act, which was introduced by and sponsored by Senator Dalton. Governor Florio signed that law, and the first time I met him, for some reason, I was in the State House briefing the governor's staff without Commissioner Weiner. Why was I there without a commissioner? I have no idea. But I was asked if I wanted to meet the governor, and so I said, sure. And you had this little tiny office, right? And he thanked me for DEP's hard work, and then he said, I know you're going to adopt these rules on time. And I looked and I look back now to see that that was the first time that Governor Florio really pushed me on some things, which he continues to do today. So that law was innovative in that the design of the law was that companies had to look at their use and generation of hazardous materials, and then they had to set a goal to reduce it. So the concept was an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The concept was if the companies had to look at their chemical use, that they would see how they could benefit from reducing it. Because if they generated less waste, if they had to dispose or treat of less waste, it would be good for them in the long run. So that seems to make a lot of sense, unless you're a company that makes chemicals. And so for that reason, the law is very controversial, and we were litigated and eventually prevailed by unanimous decisions in the court. I think just based on the governor's comment about that this is not intended to be about nostalgia, but about lessons learned, is one of my lessons learned, many lessons learned from that experience, was the value of data and the value of information, because those data are still collected on an annual basis, but not used so much. And so currently, I work here at the university, I work at the Blaustein School, and one of the things that I do is I facilitate a coalition of people working on climate change, and Governor Florio is our honorary chair. And so about 2 years ago, he pushed again and said, I don't understand why you're not looking at climate change and using data like right-to-know data. And that was a great challenge. And so currently we're about to finish a project where we're taking that pollution prevention data, which not too many folks are looking at these days, and we're overlaying that with data about current and projected flood hazards and sea level rise. And I expect that sometime this summer you'll all be seeing that data, and I think we'll probably get a big splash. But that was definitely something that came from the governor, and I appreciate that push. Most recently, the governor has also pushed us to think about the connections between climate change and impacts on public health. And so the reason that I was late today, and I'm sure the governor would have joined us if he were not here, was that we actually had an assemblage of more than 100 local public health officers coming together to talk about impacts of climate change on public health. So thank you for that push as well. I think the last comment I would make, and then pass it along, is I think in terms of thinking about legacy, there is something that's, to me, not on the list. And being slightly sentimental, I will point out that when I went to the signing of the pollution prevention law, it was at the Shearing Plow facility. Lance, you might have been there, I'm not sure. And I brought my then one-year-old daughter, Sarah, to the signing. And Sarah now is 26 and works at the New Jersey DEPE. And well, she's leaving, but. And 2 years ago, she had the opportunity to, I guess, sort of be the governor's host at a conference on historic preservation. And she was so honored because she had heard about my admiration for you for 25 years. And so I think your part of your legacy is that sort of inspiration to those who've come after you and after us. And my last legacy item, and John, it's not on the list, and I'm a little shocked, is the value of the voluntary furlough program.
It's on there.
Is
That
it
was
there?
done for financial
No,
reasons.
that's the sabbatical reason.
It
That's that's different, which allowed a generation of women to come into the department and balance work and family. And when I came back from my maternity leave with that 26-year-old who now works at New Jersey DEPE, it was the first time I met Scott Weiner, who said, I will take you as much as I can get you. And that allowed me to work part-time and to implement the pollution prevention program. And there was an entire generation of women my age who had the opportunity to do that, most of whom have probably retired from the department. But I hope you will consider as part of your legacy helping to develop an entire generation of women who have become environmental professionals. And I'm tremendously grateful for that.
Well, this other environmental initiatives wasn't intended to be complete. In fact, I was going to ask, anybody got any other suggestions or things to add on here?
Can I follow up on pollution prevention just real quick? My reward for doing that ECRA to ISRA thing was to have Hal Bozarth target me as soon as the new administration came in. And if it wasn't for Jeanne Fox, my career in state and federal government would have ended at that point in time. But Jeanne rescued me and sent me off to EPA to work on a permits improvement team. The pit. Now,
That was a joke Carol Brewer didn't get it. When we sent it up to her, she actually accepted it as a...
But
She has no sense of humor.
right. But the important thing here, we've talked a lot about how New Jersey's led things and other states and around the country have picked them up. This was an interesting one on pollution prevention because Jeanne asked me as part of our interactions with industry, literally across the country, was to talk about pollution prevention. And I raised it at a meeting with industry, and we understand pollution. Not a whole lot of buy-in on the record. One of the environmental representatives from industry came up to me afterwards and said, Lance, here's the story in industry. I go in, I am competing on a budget with other departments within the company. You regulate something, I can go in and say, I have to do this, this, and this to comply with this regulation. Gets funded automatically. I now come in and say, I want these extra funds for pollution prevention, and it's going to save us this much money down the road. I'm now competing with all the R&D activities, all the other cost savings or cost generating aspects of the company, and I can't compete there. You want us to do pollution prevention, regulate it. And that taught me a tremendous lesson about how important government regulations are in determining the behavior of industry. And it's something I applied from that point forward in my career.
One other lesson I had from that experience, because New Jersey and Massachusetts implemented their pollution prevention laws at exactly the same time, and despite the fact that Massachusetts was not a chemical producing state, their law had one other little difference, which was that it established what they called toxic use reduction consultants. And those consultants became available to industry to help them to look at their chemical use and generation. And all of a sudden, Massachusetts had a constituency for their law because those consultants didn't want to lose their law, whereas we did not have that. And so that lesson has stuck with me for the last 25 years and has really helped me to think about when you develop a regulation, particularly one that's controversial, you need to think about who are the winners, who are the losers, who's going to love it, who's going to hate it, and take the ones who are going to love it and develop them as a constituency and keep them close to you because they will kind of cover you and be there to support you when times get rough.
The current debate about the Toxic Substance Control Act in Washington raises the issue that was raised with pollution prevention as well, the question of preemption. the fact of the matter is that New Jersey's always felt very strongly about having the best laws that we can have, notwithstanding what the national law is. Now we've now changed this, going backwards in Washington, so as to preempt states' ability to have more protective laws rather than set. And that was the debate, part of the pollution prevention debate, because we're coming off of the Reagan administration, which was talking about lowering the standards at the federal level, and if they were preempting the state level, you would have had a bad problem. So there's something to be learned from the things that we've experienced.
Now, I have a question, Rick. Did Greta talk about legislation at all? What were her fun bills that she worked on?
I don't think Greta said anything yet.
I'm just eating us all up. Thank you. I mean, I haven't read any particular bill except I was talking to Frank Sweeney before. I remember spending a lot of time on the Permit Extension Act. Oh. One of the more exciting pieces of writing I've ever looked at. You know, it went on for weeks and weeks and weeks, back and forth, and it, got to be a hobby, No, I enjoy working at the department very much, and I was mentioning before to Mary Shield, when before I went to work with Scott, I was working for Senator Cantillo, and Senator Paul Cantillo was the sponsor of the Mandatory Recycling Act. And I'll tell you that, talk about raucous caucuses, there were a lot of people who didn't want to see that go any further than his brilliant mind. But it did, and it seems to have set a standard for this state anyway, still going on. I came from the good experience of running for election in a second legislative district in 1989, after having won an election in another district in the 70s, and losing. Again, the people in both districts preferred Republicans at that point, and be kind of thinking that I would not go back to work for Paul Cantillo, but maybe I would like to do something in the new administration. One of the great fun things of that previous year, by the way, was that many times I had you and Lucinda to campaign with, and that made it really a good run. So Scott is going to be at the BPU, and he wanted me to do legislation, and we're at the board, and we're only there a short time. I don't think I got used to the streets in Newark before. The idea was we were going to really inhabit the Trenton office so that we would have a place we could be in Trenton, and some place where he could come and, the commissioners, the assistant commissioners, and they were going to testify, or there's a cabinet meeting, we'd have a home. And it wasn't long before that home didn't seem big enough. So we then were able to get a spot down the street in a lovely old, one of the best offices I ever had, one of the old buildings across the street from the State House. And I got to pick an office in the back that had its own entrance, and it was, it was just great. And he wasn't there all the time, But when he came down, we knew it. His secretary, Sandy McGee, would get the phone call, he's on his way. Put away all those things you're doing and get some real work in front of you. It was a great experience. And the next thing I know, we're at the DEP, and then we get the E to come with us. So we're at the DEPE. It was a great experience for me. I learned a lot from the talented people in the department all through those years. I have absolutely no scientific background, and I don't understand a lot of the science. I think what I bring to the business of politics, but certainly of the department, was I think I understand people pretty well. And I like people, and I like to work with people, and I like to talk to them. I like to listen to people, which I find teaches me a lot. So here I am, enjoying this day of all these remembrances we all have, and all the people that we work with, and how great an experience it's been to be in public life all these years. Don't believe what you hear in the campaign. Don't believe that we're all old crooks. We actually have contributed and been able to help a lot of people over the years, and I'm proud to be a politician. Thank you.
Well, like Greta, I don't have any background either in science or technical programs, which is why Scott may be the assistant minister for science and technical programs. I'm struck, and I'd never thought this before, but in listening to Jeanne's description of the Pollution Prevention Act, that there are some eerie similarities between the Pollution Prevention Act and the State Planning Act, in the sense that, as you now recollect 25 years later, what could we have done to strengthen it or to make it more effective and to have it either be mandatory or to have the businesses understand the importance of taking particular steps? The State Planning Act suffers from the same difficulty. Always has, and evidently, from what I can gather, always will. I'm very proud of the fact that the adoption of the first state plan took place in the Florio administration. The State Planning Act was passed in the 1980s. It was, many of you will not remember the motivation for it. The motivation for it was that the Supreme Court said that on the Mount Laurel ruling that any municipality in a growth area had to provide its fair share of low and moderate income housing. But there was nothing in the law that indicated what a growth area was. And the State Planning Act grew out of that, a way of identifying growth areas, non-growth areas, and then determining on some kind of a presumably rational basis what a community or municipality's fair share would be. It morphed into a much larger enterprise in trying to essentially, I think if you were to talk about what the State Planning Act's ultimate direction was, it was to say we've had enough of private development decisions driving public infrastructure investment. It's about time that we had public infrastructure decisions drive private development decisions. That if we were to adopt a program or a plan that said that there are certain parts of the state, Pinelands being a primary example, where there will be no growth, certain areas of the highlands, certain areas that are determined to be environmentally sensitive, would just be off limits to growth. There are areas, primarily urban areas, and those that were already built up and were suffering from decline, where there would be a positive reinforcement for redevelopment, and that then there would be a series of gradations of suburban areas, what was referred to as a fringe area. And I think the problem was that we made them, well, the State Planning Commission made the mistake at one point of coming up with a map. And as soon as you come up with a map, everybody looks at it and says, well, this looks like a zoning map to me. You're telling me that I can't build here, I can build there. And we had planning area 1, planning area 2, planning area 3, and now everybody's arguing, I don't want to be in planning area 2, I want to be in 3, or I don't want to be in 3, I want to be in 2. And we, I mean, I am proud of the fact that we passed a plan. I went to work years later for New Jersey Future, which is an organization whose primary responsibility is to push the state plan. And it's fighting the same battle today, which is if the law doesn't have teeth, if it doesn't say to a municipality, we're not going to give, well, you signed an executive order, I think the last day in office, saying that henceforth transportation, any discretionary funds, transportation funds, energy funds, infrastructure funds, would be directed to areas that were deemed to be development or redevelopment areas under the state plan. That is as strong a statement, I think, that has ever been made to try to implement the state plan. And we're still fighting, I think, what is a losing battle today in that regard.
There was one other attempt to implement the state plan through regulation, and that was the watershed management rules that were proposed in the late 1990s. But unfortunately, Governor Whitman went off to EPA, and Gary knows what happened to me for my attempt to implement that regulation properly, and came up against Commissioner Shin, and Jeanne came to my rescue again, and I ended up at the BPU. But the key point was, how do you take the state plan
and tie it to a regulatory program that will allow the state plan to be implemented legally. And we had the DAG sign off on it. We had the appropriate way to do it. It made total sense. And the key was, Dennis knows this, we treat, with the sewer ban rules and stuff, we treat development, if you're going to get a sewer, differently than if you're going to put septic tanks in. Okay? This rule changed that, okay, and said, if you're putting in more than 10 septics, I think was the cutoff, because that triggers a regulatory threshold, you have to do the same type of studies as if you were sewering it. So now we raised the bar up, and then that brought in the state plan to say where those areas were. Unfortunately, it didn't get implemented.
I disagree with the legislature, because the issue of the state plan was the map. Rick hit it right on the head. Brad, but the map, but no, at all times it was the map.
The map came later.
The map was always the issue. Rick was absolutely right. And everybody got uptight because of the map. And I've seen it from both sides, having been there with in the minority as minority leader and as speaker, and then being commissioner of the Department of Community Affairs, trying to do the state plan. And, I've seen it from both sides, and the problem is it's a great concept. It's something we need to do, but it needs to be better explained, and it needs to be developed so that it's not a hard and fast situation. You need the flexibility, and that's where the problem came in. And that's the problem. Today, there is no state plan. Once it got moved out of DCA, went to wherever it is now, the Secretary of State's Lieutenant Governor, wherever. It's a never land. But the concept was very good. It was just that it was never clearly explained to the legislature. And so whether it was Republicans or Democrats, and again, Dan can talk about the Senate and John can also, it always became the bête noire. It was always, whenever you needed to have a scapegoat, very fitting with our Republican national candidate now, whenever you needed a scapegoat to complain about, the developers used the state plan as the state scapegoat. And of course, the other scapegoat was Cohen. So those two were always tied together, and then once they were tied together, there was no hope to move it. But it was always a problem in the legislature for that reason.
But to give you a sense of the discussion, the legislative discussions, I got a letter when I signed the state plan. Got a letter from a very sophisticated person who went beyond just calling me a communist. I was a Leninist communist.
I remember Jerry Stockman, who was the Senate sponsor, saying when the bill was being debated that he was spending half his time going around telling people that the state was being overgrown with development and we had to get this passed, and then the other half of his time saying, it's just advisory, don't worry about it. And that was the conflict that the law did not clear.
And to his credit, Carrie Edwards, who was Tom Kaine's Attorney General, was a forceful advocate for the state plan and really worked very hard, even well into his in private life, to see it implemented. And the other thing I should say in its defense, and like pollution prevention, again, one of the things that happened for the state plan was this elaborate and excruciating cross-acceptance process of getting counties and municipal planning boards to buy into the concept of what the state plan was pursuing. And a number of municipalities and counties, although they've never formally adopted any kind of statement of we're going to do this according to the state plan, have in fact learned sort of in a sophisticated way how they can carry out the objectives of the plan. Just I think as a lot of businesses recognize that even if it wasn't absolutely mandatory, there were things that they could learn from the process that would be beneficial to them. So I don't want to suggest that it's been a complete failure, because I think there has been a major, a higher level of understanding at local planning levels and at regional planning entities about what the state plan concept is about.
And I just want to add 2 comments to Rick's comment on teeth, because I completely agree. So the first is I don't want anyone to leave here today thinking that Governor Florio's Pollution Prevention Act doesn't have teeth. It has teeth. They were not initially deployed. And I think had there been a second term, the implementation of that law would have gone on a very different path. And so perhaps the next administration will do a creative reading of the law to see where those teeth are hidden. I think second is, I totally agree that as we look at the need for teeth, the other benefit of teeth in regulation and in laws is the cost effectiveness of it, that it allows you to efficiently implement laws, and we've certainly seen the lack of implementation under the Global Warming Response Act, which does not have teeth, and a lot of time and money that's been spent initially to develop that program and then to dismantle that program. So I guess one thought I would present in terms of the concepts of today, which is lessons learned, is that, you know, as we look at, there's a lot of gray hair in this room, and there's a lot of lessons learned in terms of the value of teeth. And I worry as I look at the next generation of people, including my daughter, who work at New Jersey DEP, that they haven't embraced that lesson. And so as a result, we're seeing a lot of voluntary programs, a lot of bottom-up programs, a lot of community-based programs, and I don't have a problem with any of those programs. But I don't think that there's been any real kind of quantitative evaluation of their effectiveness and cost effectiveness. And that's worrisome moving forward.
A wonderful example of a successful teeth program is the Pinelands.
Yes.
The Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan, everyone has to sign on to it. And frankly, over the years that it's been there, people locally now appreciate the fact that they've signed on to it. They get access to the staff to supplement their resources. So it's a good example of something that's fairly strong.
Right. And one other, and I'll stop talking then, but one other really great example, if we have spent a lot of time since Sandy talking to coastal communities about what their needs are to truly become resilient. And the number one thing that every community that we've talked to, whether it's community-based organizations or local officials or paid professionals or mayors, is we need decision-making from the state in terms of standards because A, we don't have the capacity to do it, and B, is we don't have the political ability to do it. And while DEP might not want to be the bad cop all the time, we need DEP to do that.
Talking about teeth, the program at EPA that Lance managed for a couple of years for us, the permanent improvement team, was to streamline, and it worked all hearings, public hearings all over it, because what we learned, what the Florio Administration did is we did public participation on everything, because we represent the people, we should listen to them. Also at EPA, though, there was a plan that Carol Browner announced with Al Gore, her guru and vice president, that allowed industries to come up with different ways to achieve the same environmental result, but not having to follow the regulations. And all the companies had, and it was wild because the vice president announced it. It was all over. It was the main priority for the agency. Hardly any companies would come in with voluntary plans. They couldn't figure out how to, they complain all the time, let us do it, we can reduce it. Literally, they had that opportunity, and they had to force a couple companies in so it wasn't a failure. But I think what Lance had said and what Jeanne says about teeth is legitimate. Voluntary programs could be well, but it's not a bottom line thing for a company. On the other hand, being heavy-handed and a dictator as a government, we've learned from other people, is not the way to go. You got to bring people together in consensus, which is what we did in the Florio administration, to feel what they want to do and move ahead with that. And that was something that I think is a major legacy that some people follow and other people don't.
Rick, I want to just go back to the state plan, if I could, for a moment. I agree with you. The cross-acceptance practice in many cases, though, did work. It got bogged down, certainly in the beginning. Everybody, the home rule thing just made, and once that map, the little map with a big map came out, I mean, and then it's not really the map. That was the best, you know, it's a map, but it's not really the map. So wait till the real map comes out. But in Monmouth County, for instance, in going through the cross-acceptance practice, it actually came to a degree that it worked out. I think a lot of it dealt with the personalities and the communities involved, to the point now that the state plan is actually utilized as a defense as to why COA should not be doing what they're doing. Almost a reverse situation. So I think a lot of that, the overall concept of the state plan is one that was difficult for people to swallow in the beginning because of the home rule barrier. But I think if it had been able to really continue even more, some counties, in our county, it's been pretty successful in getting.
I think a lot of the developers have bought into the notion of cluster development.
Yeah, absolutely.
And first of all, they see it as beneficial to them financially. They don't want to eat up a lot of open space with more suburban sprawl. And more important, they see that millennials prefer that as a location. A lot of millennials don't want to drive cars. So I think there is, but it's interesting that now it appears to be the market that is driving this, as opposed to any government regulation or program or initiative.
Had the market to be developed if you didn't have the concept.
Very possibly, very possibly. There are a couple of other items on the agenda here. One of them is the in-house sabbatical program, which I asked to be put on there just because I thought it was a really, really interesting initiative on Scott's part. There are two initiatives that I can recall in keeping with what Jeanne has talked about in terms of openness and collaboration. One was turning the first floor of the DEP into a huge public room, where I remember in particular one legislative budget session where the entire Appropriations Committee came over to the department, and we hosted them instead of vice versa.
And they had that public information with the full-time person.
Which was an ELEC project that's what we had done at ELEC, and it's something I wanted to repeat in terms of getting public access.
And I think it was
It's called the library, but there was some regulation saying departments couldn't have their
Right.
own library.
But it sent a message. It sent a message that the DEP was open to the public, and that first floor, you walked in, you had an opportunity to meet people there, you could have hearings there, you could have meetings there. It was important. And internally, from the standpoint of department morale, I think the in-house sabbatical program, which I cannot imagine taking place today, was very successful. It defies the notion that every person who works in every program in every part of the department is indispensable for more than a day. We had people coming anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months. On a voluntary basis with the approval of their directors or assistant commissioners. Lance was the first one to approve a 3-month sabbatical for a young woman who really flourished in the program.
And thanks me for that to this day.
Does she?
Yes.
I'm delighted to hear that.
I met her at a retirement party the other day, and she came up to me and said, I want to thank you for doing that. It was a life-changing
Yeah, it was.
opportunity.
It was. She got divorced shortly thereafter. That happens to be true, by the way. But now, it was. What most of the work that was done by the sabbatical program is a lead-in to the next issue, which was environmental indicators. And I have to say that if there is one regret that I have, well, there are many regrets that I have about not having a second administration, but the major regret that I have was that we never had the opportunity to implement a set of environmental indicators that would be like leading economic indicators, a real indication of what was happening to the environment. Was it improving? Was it not improving? What were our environmental outcomes? And I found. My wife just read the Japanese art of tidying up, and so I threw away practically everything that I haven't looked at in the last 20 years, but I did save this one speech that I gave at the beginning of an EPA national program on environmental indicators, and I just wanted to read a little bit from it to give you some sense of what we were looking for. There were a group of us, some senior officials of state agencies, and in particular a couple of high-level EPA Washington people who seized upon this crazy notion that maybe our agencies should spend a little less time measuring bureaucratic outputs and pay a little more attention to environmental outcomes. That we asked people to tear their attention away from NPDES permits and RECRA and CERCLA and the SIP and Section 404 planning documents and start answering some fundamental questions that all of us in the business of preserving and protecting our environment are being asked with increasing frequency these days. Is the air getting cleaner? Is the water more drinkable or fishable or swimmable than it was last year or 5 years ago or 10 years ago? For all the millions upon millions of dollars that we've invested in environmental programs in recent years, what have we purchased in the way of environmental improvements? It was a painstaking process to try to come up with, and in fact we never did, an actual set of indicators. But the idea was, and I think there are two groundbreaking programs in this regard. One is in the state of Florida and the other is in the Chesapeake Bay, where every year the Chesapeake Bay comes out with a set of indicators that say, here's the water quality as it was in this location last year, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. Here's what it is today. Here is how many ozone days we have had this year compared to 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. One of their cleverest ones is there's a state legislator who lives on the Chesapeake Bay. Every year on the same day, he would walk into the water and measure how far he had to walk before he could no longer see his toes. And then that would be one. I mean, these are easy to understand, very, very, not, you know, it's not meant to try to measure how well the department is performing. It's to measure how well we're doing environmentally. We all hear every month or every couple of weeks or whatever leading economic indicators that say we're doing this, we're doing that, this shows this trend, this shows that trend. Why couldn't we do the same thing in terms of the environment? We devote this, the Sabbatical team really threw itself into this and devoted a tremendous amount of time and attention to it, and I think we were on the verge of, and by the way, at the national level, we were having much greater difficulty finding any consensus among the different state agencies of national environmental indicators. But I think at the New Jersey level, we really were at the point of being able to come up with a set of indicators that people could understand and relate to and would buy into. And unfortunately, we didn't have that opportunity.
There are other things that we were prepared in every single friggin' division to work on if we had had another term. You might want to ask, because I know Gary has his reports here, of which only one was implemented and two weren't. But in every area, we were ready to rock and roll, as Scott would say, moving forward, and the state would have been a lot better off. But thanks to the NRA.
So we're coming to the end of this, and as I said at the outset, we want to supplement this record with anything anyone has that would be helpful for that. So whether they're documents or transition reports from either 89 or 93 or other things that you, and our preference would be that you lend them to us so we can scan them in and give them back to you, but if not, we'll take them. That would be great, or photographs or clippings. Let me just ask before I call the governor, is there anyone who would like, particularly people who haven't spoken much, have anything they want to add that we've missed? Or?
I want to say something real quick. I've been listening, and some of the stuff I'm thinking, where was I? I don't remember a lot. I think there were other things we were working on. But I learned, going way back to the beginning, a lesson that I learned, and that I mentioned this to Joe Donahue, and I teach this now when I'm doing strategic communications or media training. The day that the governor announced his candidacy in 1989, we did it in Hoboken and Asbury Park. And we only talked about one thing: clean drinking water, clean beaches. And I remember a couple of veteran reporters coming up to me later on saying, that was the worst announcement speech I've ever heard. He only talked about one thing. And meanwhile, you're driving up and down the turnpike and hearing on the radio, Jim Florio announced his candidacy today saying he vowed that we'd have clean drinking water and open the beaches. And it's like, yeah, you know, and so what I teach people now is if you only want one thing to be the message, then only say one thing. Don't make there be a choice. So the policies and everything we've talked about here are fantastic. I learned a little bit of a lesson from the environmental, political way that we discuss things.
Well, let me just say thank you to everyone for this, but it tells you something about my life, that this is enjoyable for me. But I want to sort of thank you to everyone. I've always believed that knowledge is power, and you can just sense that everyone around the table is intimately involved in what they were involved with, knowing how to go out and talk to people, explain to people. As the issues become more complex, not just in the environment, but the environment's a good example. As the issues become more complex, it's essential that we have leadership to go out and explain what the options are. Because there are options, and each of them have pluses and minuses. And we've got to get people engaged and informed. Because these things, as we all know from Washington and politics nowadays, there are folks out there who are prepared to give you understandable, simple, wrong answers. And so forth. Someone's got to be out there countering that. And most of the problems really have good answers that are understandable if you explain them, in terms of even in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. As long as you have full costs evaluated, full benefits evaluated. You have to, external costs have to be brought into the mix. It takes a little work. My apprehension about contemporary politics, no one wants to do the work. No one wants to really become engaged because it's not easy. I mean, there's no answer that's totally positive. There's always some plus. And no one wants to engage because if you engage, raise the question, raise the issue, someone's going to say, what are you going to do about it? And then you're going to get somebody unhappy. And if somebody's unhappy, they're not going to be able to contribute to your campaign. So I'm just really encouraging all of you to go out and be disciples for those principles that you believe in getting engaged and getting people informed. So thank you. Hopefully we help.